The Uncharted series is one I hold close to my heart. Ever since I played the second entry as a kid, Naughty Dog has had me and my wallet hook, line, and sinker. Because of that, I have over the last few years reviewed every Uncharted game, Golden Abyss included, and this video is a compilation of those reviews, and a final video at the end where I rank the games. As usual, I understand most of you have this video on your second monitor or on your phone while you're about to fall asleep. I see you. So I've done my best to remix the audio to a more consistent level, turning down any loud bits. With that said, thank you for your support, and enjoy the video. Greatness from small beginnings. It's a phrase that is repeated on more than a few occasions throughout Uncharted: Drake's Fortune, and poetically, it serves as a phrase that can be applied to the game as a whole within the context of the series, with each entry being greater than the last, and with the quality gap between Uncharted 1 and 2 being as colossal as it is, it's no surprise that the series' humble beginnings doesn't receive a lot of love these days. This doesn't come as a surprise because the future Uncharted games are, while not immune to criticism, praised to near infinity, and in my eyes for good reason. Since Uncharted 2, the first of the series I had played, I had been hooked and loved the third and fourth entries to the series, so much so that I want to begin a marathon of sorts to give my thoughts on the whole franchise. But before we get into what will hopefully be some gushing reviews of the creme de la creme of this series, we need to start from the beginning. Now, according to a poll that was posted a while back, Drake's Fortune isn't at the top of many people's lists, but many of you also clarified that the game isn't necessarily bad by any means. It actually reminded me a lot of the Arkham series, as Arkham Asylum is seen as the worst, but not because the game is bad. It's great, actually, but because its sequels are so much better. Asylum was released in 2009, but it was surprisingly almost 4 years earlier that Naughty Dog began work on Uncharted, as in 2005 they decided to take a new approach to development and their games. Being well known for the Crash Bandicoot and Jack games that were stylized to something like a cartoon, attempting to transition to realistic humanized games would prove to be difficult. Making such a large pivot development-wise was something Naughty Dog was aware of, and as such they titled this new project Big. A big game for a big jump in technology. With the 7th generation of consoles on the horizon, games were no longer prohibited from making realistic art styles by the hardware, and while plenty of games still went for a stylized look, Project Big wanted to plant itself somewhere between the two. Upon first being shown at E3 2006, it was immediately compared to the ever-popular Tomb Raider games, and was promptly dubbed Dude Raider on internet forums. Of course, the Tomb Raider games focus far more on puzzles than Uncharted, though Uncharted eventually shifted to focusing more on puzzles and exploration, and I'd argue the Uncharted games and the reboot Tomb Raider games did a bit more than share test answers, if you know what I'm saying, but that's for another video. The point is, Uncharted, while not a wildly new concept for a game, was definitely uncharted territory for the Naughty Dog team, and thankfully this new direction paid off. Uncharted: Drake's Fortune sold quite well and was received even better, with many critics citing its production quality, score, voice acting, level of detail, and set pieces as its strengths, but did acknowledge that some of the game's vehicle segments overstayed their welcome. Trust me, we will talk about that later. And the game did so well that it launched Naughty Dog to the forefront of AAA development for the 7th generation, spawning the aforementioned sequels. With such an interesting story and history tied to this game, it warrants taking a look back at Uncharted: Drake's Fortune 14 years later. And just a warning, spoilers ahead. Uncharted is a good-looking game, though I don't think I'm in the minority of believing that the game's stylistic potential wasn't fully realized until future entries. The game's textures look great for the time, and the remastered touch-ups are nice. Some blemishes still show, as scenes with an open ocean look like the same bump map is repeated every yard or so, but the characters look great, and the gunplay, while with today's standards aren't anything special technically, it still does the job more than well enough. But I couldn't help feeling like this technical ability and production quality was misused. We trudged through so many mud and crud-filled forests, and almost the entire third act of the game takes place within caves and underground ruins. Not only does that further enforce the Dude Raider title the game had received, but in general it felt very generic. It seemed like it was just imitating the likes of popular action flicks like Indiana Jones, and that's down to the base premise of an everyman going on a treasure hunt, although it might be important to consider that perhaps that was the point. Uncharted is by all means an action film, told through the medium of a video game. I know that a phrase like that can seem vague, so to further clarify, I'll point to the many explosive vehicles, collapsing buildings, and moments where Nate barely escapes danger, be that a fall, a bad guy, or a shotgun in the face. All while these intense events are unfolding, Drake continues to deliver charming one-liners, and while that is indicative of his familiarity with the lifestyle of a modern-day treasure hunter, if not pirate, from another angle it looked like Naughty Dog was wearing their influences on their sleeve. I appreciate the way Uncharted lays its cards on the table, because it allowed me to play the game with the same mindset I would have when watching a dumb Hollywood blockbuster. This doesn't mean I went into this game with my brain off. I still paid ample attention to the story, and we will talk about that later, but I also made sure to do another playthrough where I just finished some collectible cleanup and decided to just go brain dead for a bit and enjoy the action. I think this is one of Uncharted's biggest strengths. If you pay attention, there's fun characters and a level of detail that most of the time rewards the player for taking a closer look at things. If you don't, well, you just see some average Joe that you can easily project yourself onto getting into crazy gunfights, which by the way look great and sound great too. The set pieces in which these fights take place are usually pretty indistinguishable from one another, as they often have an overabundance of green leaves or gray bricks, though there are some interesting twists. One sees you in a church, another on the back of a truck where you can shoot trees which will cause them to fall over, and even a shootout occurs on a jet ski, and while the gameplay is only mildly infuriating, the fidelity and visual aspect of it is great. I do wish that the game had a greater range of sets for our main characters to play in, but I think the selection here for a game that came out in 2007 is great, and even to this day it's acceptable in my eyes. My only real criticism is that I felt the underground Nazi base felt very disconnected from the rest of the game, to the point where speaking the sentence aloud feels like a shitpost. There were other things that caused this environmental whiplash, as the enemies here were unlike any we had faced before, and we had to use an entirely different fighting style to defeat them with guns from World War II. To be fair though, what's a Western action flick without a bad guy that's either German or Russian? The Germans' involvement in the plot is also hinted at earlier in the story as you explore a U-boat that is stuck near the edge of a waterfall, and this is just one of the claustrophobic interiors which have the camera stilted and mounted to a corner as Nathan stumbles his way through. And I use the word stumble intentionally. Nathan Drake is meant to be an average Joe, and his animations reflect this. He stumbles quite a bit and is often seen tripping over things, and not to an extent where he isn't taken seriously, but to enough of an extent to stop him from being seen as a flawless killing machine. When being shot at while running, he ducks and cowers haphazardly, and he visibly flinches when getting shot at behind cover. When he does actually get shot at, he jerks in the appropriate direction, and it adds to the realism of the game. Something interesting about this game is that Nathan dies in one shot. He can take a few punches, sure, but you'll always be greeted with a game over upon getting shot. Now, if you're familiar with the game, then you know I'm bullshitting here. Hell, the footage itself shows Nathan getting shot at, but according to Naughty Dog, Nathan's health bar, which is represented by the saturation of the screen, is actually his luck. If Nathan dies in 5 shots, it means he barely missed 4 of them through luck, and by the 5th shot his luck has run out and he's taking that fatal blow. I like this because it's an easy explanation for how many bullets this guy can chew on when on easier difficulties, and it plays into the classic action movie trope of the hero getting extremely lucky. My only issue with this lies in the way it's presented. When you take damage, the game slowly loses its vibrance, and eventually, when you basically have one foot in the grave, the screen is entirely black and white. Before I criticize this, I should mention that I understand why Naughty Dog did this. If the game is going to present a cinematic experience, the first thing that would pull you out of your immersion is a heads-up display with a mini-map, ammo indicator, health bar, and God knows what else. I believe this is why there's no map, and the heads-up display elements are as minimalistic as it gets. The issue that arises here is, especially on harder difficulties, your vision during shootouts will be washed out far more than it isn't. For example, take a really awesome scene where Nate is on the back of a vehicle with a turret. Notice how despite me shooting the enemies almost immediately upon their spawn, I'm taking a hit. And while I don't mind taking a hit, I was sitting there consistently in this black and white tone and missing out on the vibrant visuals accompanying this setting. Now, my issue with the criticism I just provided is that I cannot think of a solution for this within what the game already has. How do we indicate player health while not impeding on the cinematic elements of the game? I don't really think you can. There might be some way we can incorporate the health bar in a way that is attached to Nathan's character model in the same way Dead Space does, but anything that is too subtle could mean that the player loses track of their health, and if it's too in your face, it could be more distracting than a potential health bar in the top left corner. Let me know if you have any ideas for a way to work this in. Since we are on the topic of character models, I'd like to mention that the designs for the main characters were memorable. Sully and Elena have iconic designs, as does our main character, and while the enemies you fight never leave the realm of generic pirate or generic military personnel, they don't need to be anything more, as they serve as an infinite wave of extras that populate the different scenes of this game. The scenes in question usually see you making use of either gunplay or climbing, both of which are quite simple, and while they have certainly benefited from the different innovations the sequels brought, they still get the job done here. I would consider the core gameplay mechanics here to be pretty bare bones and don't really do anything to innovate. There's a good chance though that this was an intentional decision. Though it doesn't excuse its minimalistic approach, it serves as a scaffolding of sorts that props up the set pieces of the game. So while I look at the gameplay in a vacuum, do remember that most of the criticisms aren't as noticeable when everything is in motion. For example, there is a pretty slim selection of weapons, but that doesn't really matter. You have a shotgun, a pistol, a few assault rifles and SMGs, a sniper, a grenade launcher, but because of how ammo in this game is structured, you'll be scrambling scrounging around for ammo so often that you'll naturally make use of all of these weapons through scarcity alone. I think the balance for the weapons here is good, and in fact the only weapon I'd say is unbalanced is the MP40, which just shreds most enemies, but it's introduced so late into the game and balanced out by the increasing enemy damage and population that it works as a way to turn you into a glass cannon and doesn't overstay its welcome. The gunplay is cover-based, which I never enjoyed much, but most encounters on most difficulties can be rushed through if your aim is tight enough. Unfortunately, I found that this was one of the most clunky aiming controls I've used in a while. I didn't experience this in any other Uncharted game, and especially not in the 4th installment, and I imagine this is just a product of its time. You will get used to it, but it might be jarring for the first couple of hours. Regardless, headshots will be invaluable throughout most of the game, and especially on brutal and crushing difficulty, you'll find yourself having no room for error. The cover itself works like you imagine, though there were a few points where enemies were shooting through walls and hitting Drake despite him being behind cover, and it didn't happen enough to be a major issue, but transferring between cover was a little wonky at times, and I typically found it less troublesome to just exit cover and re-enter it after walking a few steps over. Your enemies can of course take cover too, and they even take different approaches to it, with some peeking out like normal, and the more nimble foes taking lower exit points being borderline prone, which spiced up the combat a bit more. Enemies will also act differently based on what guns they have, with shotgun-wielding foes rushing you and snipers hanging back. Simple stuff, but the game often throws everything in the kitchen sink at you, and I never felt the gunplay was unfair or overwhelming, and at most it's just overstimulating, but in a good way. A playstyle and enemy I've avoided talking about up to this point is the run and gunning and the Descendants. The Descendants are these demonic humans that have been corrupted by this game's antagonistic curse of El Dorado. They move quickly, rush you down, and hit like a semi. I like these guys a lot because they turn the normal gunplay on its head, and while run and gun isn't perfect, it is reliable enough to deal with these guys. When running and gunning, you get a wider crosshair, and when an enemy is near that crosshair, most of the bullets will hit them, even if you are just barely aiming at them. This makes up for the lack of precision that comes with the shooting and the controls. I think the only time these enemies can be a pain is when they're mixed in with the human enemies who are best dealt with whilst behind cover, but even that has a solution. Fortunately, the human enemies and the Descendants will automatically aggro each other, so the solution to dealing with the mixed enemies is to kill the Descendants first and then deal with the humans like usual, or wait a few years for them to kill each other, but come on, that's boring. You can also melee enemies with light and heavy attacks, but I genuinely found no use for this as they do barely any damage compared to guns, and a majority of fights are taking place behind cover, so you won't really have an opportunity to get up close and personal. Whenever you're not pumping enemies full of lead, you'll be climbing some sort of unstable surface. The climbing in itself is simple, as it just sees you pressing X to jump from one ledge to another ledge, and pressing circle to drop to a ledge. I found the drop to ledge mechanic super finicky though, because sometimes Drake would drop down like he's supposed to, and other times he would hilariously roll off to his death. I ended up just gambling every time I needed to drop down, which was pretty annoying at times. Fortunately, that's the worst that the climbing has to offer, and unfortunately, there isn't much else to offer. The climbing always sees you moving from a stable cliff face, pipe, or ledge to an unstable one, which means you have to quickly jump to the next, and while this does create tension cinematically, it never translated to gameplay very well. In fact, I never felt any sense of danger in the climbing because it's borderline impossible to unintentionally fail, excluding the ledge drop mechanic. Since you can virtually never make a mistake in the platforming, it has little tension or agency, and once you realize that, the climbing can become tedious. The falling platforms mentioned before add to this, as it seems like every climbable object is going to give away, and the first time it happens you think, oh, I better get a move on, but by the 100th time you find yourself more surprised when a pipe does actually hold your weight. The gunplay and climbing also barely intersect, which is unfortunate, but they function well as an excuse to get Nate from one scene to the next. Unfortunately, from a design perspective, the levels here are pretty bare bones and skeletal. It's usually just a room with some boxes that act as cover, and while I don't think my expectations are that high, I would have liked to see more dynamic environments. I wish I had more to talk about, but all the levels here just follow the same structure of an open square room with boxes for cover. Of course, in a treasure hunting adventure such as this, there are bound to be puzzles, and they function more as a roadblock than anything else. The major issue with the puzzles here is that the answer is almost always given to you from the start. Nate has his ancestor, Sir Francis Drake's journal, which will help him solve the many puzzles leading to El Dorado. And by help, I mean the work is done for you. One of the first is just pulling levers in the right order, like it's labeled. The puzzle is already solved, and to add to that, actually completing the solution is tedious. Every time you pull said lever, the camera has to zoom out and present the changes in the room to you, and considering that you have to jump from platform to platform, the tedium just gets turned up to 11. You could write this off because it's the first puzzle in the game. Fortunately, the next puzzle sees you turning statues to face a particular direction. The notepad again tells you which way to turn the statues, as they are labeled by their cardinal directions, though it doesn't have an anchor point, meaning there will be some trial and error. It is unfortunately another instance where the game gives you the answer to a puzzle and makes the completion of the puzzle unnecessarily lengthy and uninteresting. While it is pretty unambitious, it's another beginner puzzle. Except it's not, I lied. The puzzle is about halfway through the game. The puzzles are consistently uninteresting and lack any sort of challenge. And you guys know I'm a fucking idiot on a good day, and what leaves me even further slack-jawed is that these puzzles have been praised. Allow me to give way too much credit here and cite thegamer.com's list of the top 10 puzzles in the Uncharted series, which just seems like they have had a list of puzzles picked at random, and they listed a puzzle I haven't discussed yet that appears in chapter 16. There are 22 chapters in the game, so this is a fair ways in. The puzzle they refer to involves some Roman numerals, and I didn't even consider this a puzzle because it took such a small amount of effort. You enter this room with a bunch of different paths, and each path has a sign with a Roman numeral. If you open your notebook, it'll tell you that the numbers 2, 5, and 7 mark the safe path, and everything else will lead to a trap. Now, not only does the map on hand literally tell you where to go, but there was a point halfway through where I just straight up forgot what the numbers were and just went on whatever path looked like it was safe, and it worked out. So please, tell me in the comments, what am I missing? Because this is listed as the second best puzzle in the entire series, and while I know that a random gaming article does not speak for the majority, I cannot for the life of me figure out where this is coming from. To summarize, there are puzzles here, but the solutions are given to you immediately, so there is no mental work for the player. I'm not saying that we need complex brain teasers or that we need to do fucking algebra 3 to get through a locked door, but for an example of what puzzles worked, look no further than some of the puzzles in the sequels. Since I'm already kinda tilted, I may as well lean further into it and talk about the vehicle sections. There are a few moments where Nate is on a vehicle and shooting some targets, while another character drives. One of these I mentioned involving the truck, and one I left out was one where Elena and Nate are on a jet ski, and we have to both drive and shoot. But get this, you can't do both at the same time. That, and there are a ton of enemies shooting you at once as they cover the surrounding buildings, so you have to make sure to drive a bit, shoot them with a grenade launcher, drive a bit, and so on. But there are also red explosive barrels that are in the water and need to be blown up, and despite being within close proximity of each other, these barrels will not blow each other up. On normal or even hard difficulties, this is annoying and definitely a low point of the game, but on crushing difficulty, it was actually maddening. Fortunately, these sections aren't too long and the checkpoints are pretty reasonable, but god, this sucked, and I'm so glad there is not another set piece like this throughout the entire series. There is also a boss fight in the game that I may as well mention because it was pretty lame, but nowhere near as bad as the jet ski, just for a comparison. You have an enemy that pops up, fires a few shots at you, and when he's reloading, you kill the goon surrounding him, and after clearing a wave, he moves farther to the back of the boat, and you just rinse and repeat this a couple of times. I think this is pretty lame because you are forced to play this the way the game wants you to. If you move to cover when you're not supposed to, you die, and near instantly too. You know you are safe as long as you are behind cover, so when the boss is shooting at you, there is no tension because he, in a rhythmic fashion, shoots and reloads. It was really easy, but there's nothing too offensive about it. The fight does end with a quick time event, and there are a few points where QTEs are used in the game. I think the QTEs here are fine as they are never intrusive and don't replace the action set pieces, and they also fit in with the theme of this being a linear interactive movie. While heading off the beaten path and gameplay is usually heavily discouraged, there are a number of collectible treasures for you to find. These are never too hard to find and were more of a distraction than anything, but upon completing the game and finding these collectibles, you get access to different bonuses. Slow motion mode, game filters, character model swaps, all the fun stuff, and I absolutely love when a game does this. Overall, the different gameplay mechanics here are really basic and clunky, but I think they come together under the greater set pieces and the presentation to form a product that is greater than the sum of its parts. While there aren't a ton of abilities to make use of, the game gives you mostly interesting and high-octane backdrops that easily make you forget how bare-bones the gameplay is. I think that's an important distinction to make here too. The gameplay on its own isn't that great, but when in motion, it is a great time. If you try to analyze the gameplay here and look at it critically, you'll see the cracks in the foundation, but if you just take everything for what it is and enjoy the ride, you'll be satisfied by the end of the journey. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on who you are, the story follows the same suit. While the story here certainly has its value, it's only gold-plated, as once you look closer, you see there are a lot of inconsistencies and oversights. But that doesn't mean the game can't be enjoyed by just not looking beneath the surface. The game opens with a sarcophagus of Sir Francis Drake being raised from the ocean and by none other than Nathan Drake, a descendant of Francis.
Well, I did do my research, and apparently Francis Drake didn't have any children.
Well, history can't be wrong, you know.
Nathan is on a boat with Elena Fisher, a reporter who, in exchange for funding Nathan's expedition, will get an exclusive look at the coffin for her news show. They are interrupted by pirates that begin shooting the pair, and while this is nothing new for Nathan, Elena certainly isn't familiar with firefights.
What's worse?
You obviously haven't been in a Panamanian jail. Do you know how to use one of these?
Fortunately, the veteran cigar-smoking treasure hunter Victor Sullivan is right around the corner with a seaplane that is able to scoop up both Nate and Elena, but not before Nate can secure the notebook of Sir Francis Drake, which has a map that leads to El Dorado, the city of gold. Once docked, Sully and Nate realize that any potential reporting could draw a hell of a lot more eyes to this treasure, so they feel that it's best to ditch Elena. As Sully and Nate continue their search, they come across a tomb that reveals that El Dorado isn't a city, but a sarcophagus of sorts that has been moved from its original resting place. Issue is, Sully has landed himself in some pretty heavy debt and needs the potential riches from this expedition to clear his debts. As they continue to explore, they come across an abandoned German U-boat that contains a map leading them to a different island. Before Nate investigates, he leaves Sully with Francis Drake's journal. As Drake leaves, Sully's debt collector, Roman, catches up to him and decides that he wants the treasure for himself rather than whatever debt Sully owed. Roman then kills Sully with a shot to the heart. Nate, with little time to mourn, runs into Elena, who caught up with him, and the two escape in a car and eventually by plane before crash landing on the island containing El Dorado. Nate makes his way to an old fort to catch up with Elena, but is captured and eventually saved by Elena. As the two recuperate, Nate decides that he wants to back out, but Elena convinces him to continue forward, and they eventually find Sullivan being held by Roman and seemingly working with him. As the two meet up with Sully, they find out that Sir Francis Drake's journal took the bullet that hit Sully, and he's been leading Roman on a wild goose chase to keep him away from the treasure. Sully continues his undercover work, then Elena and Nate eventually get separated while Nathan meets up with his captor from the fort, Eddie Raja, and the two have to team up to defeat these new descendants that end up killing Eddie. After this, Elena and Nate discover the body of Sir Francis Drake and realize that he never got to the treasure, and this hits Drake pretty hard. As they continue forward, they end up in an older German World War II bunker. When getting split up again, Nate discovers that the descendants are actually humans infected with a curse that is housed inside the golden idol. El Dorado isn't a treasure, it's a curse. As Nathan returns to Elena, it's revealed that she had been captured by Roman, and Nate is unable to regroup with Sully, but they are too late. And Roman opens El Dorado, immediately turning into a descendant and being shot by his sidekick, Navarro. Navarro then reveals that he knew about the curse and that the gold which holds the curse has no value when compared to the curse held inside, if sold to the right buyer. Sully and Nate break free, and Nate chases Navarro to a boat with Elena, and he takes him down with a QuickTime event. As they are about to leave, Sully shows up with a literal boatload of gold, and the three make their way back home, and that's where our story ends. So right off the bat, you probably noticed a lot of inconsistencies, and that's okay. I think getting the not so good stuff out of the way first is the best move because there is a lot to love about this story, but unfortunately there's a lot of things holding the plot back. Let's at least acknowledge the minor quirks, such as, how did Elena track Sully and Nate down after she is stranded on an island? How did she know where they were going? How did she get the proper tools to get to them? Why would Sully and Nate leave Elena on an island after almost getting killed by pirates? Like, how is that at all morally correct? Don't get me wrong, there's a disconnect because Nate kills thousands by the end of a playthrough in gameplay, but that never really bothered me because it was in gameplay, and any killing that's done in the cutscenes was done in self-defense, more or less. But stranding Elena just seems strange. Why does Nate just not really care about Sully being dead? And I understand he has bigger problems at hand, but even during downtime, he really doesn't show signs of grief, despite knowing him for decades. Also, why doesn't Nate not trust Sully when the two have known each other for so long? He sees one video of him with Roman and just assumes that he's working with him. Maybe they just didn't think about it because this is the first game and Sully's involvement with Nate isn't clearly explained until the third game. I don't know. Anywho, the point is there are a few little oversights, but they never got in the way of my enjoyment personally. That enjoyment also never came from the overarching plot, but rather the interactions with the characters. Nate and Sully's banter is a ton of fun, and it does a great job of filling in the downtime. Even during gunfights, Nate won't stop quipping, but I never felt he overdid it. It was just the right amount of cheese for me. Whether it's talking about finding a bride in a brothel, or about a Panamanian jail, there's always something mildly interesting that warrants listening to with both Nate and Sully, and Nate and Elena.
Getting out.
All right, Nate, just pretend for a minute that I don't really care about any of that stuff and cut to the chase, would you?
Man only interested in the climax. He must be a real hit with the ladies.
Never had any complaints.
Okay then, I'll jump to the good part, just for you.
Going back to the oversights, there were a few larger decisions that pulled me out of my experience, such as when Navarro gets the drop on Drake. Drake just turns his back to the guy with the shotgun, who doesn't try to shoot him at all, by the way, and musters the strength to push a helicopter overboard, and somehow Navarro is standing in the perfect spot for his leg to get caught in a rope, and it's like, okay, now you're really pushing it. And just to add to this, Sully then shows up and says, yeah, I killed 2 people and made out with this gold. Like, I understand that much like the action flicks this game is based on, there will be extreme cases of luck, and some suspension of disbelief is required, but I felt that all of this back-to-back made it hard to just not think about. While Sully and Nate are more than than acquainted long before the events of the game, Nate and Elena are a pair that were consistently growing on each other and myself. At the beginning of the game, they don't really trust each other and are quite cold in the way Nate refuses to let her film Francis Drake's journal and actively asks for the camera to be out of his face, but by the end of the game, he's totally on board.
Yeah, I'm afraid this is as close as we're getting to El Dorado.
Drake also comes pretty close to having a moment of reflection when he discovers Francis Drake's body, but the game doesn't go very far with it. His idol, who he's looked up to for supposedly a very long time, is just laying there with his goal of finding El Dorado left unaccomplished. This, for some time, crushed Drake, but then we find out that Francis Drake wasn't searching for El Dorado, but rather trying to hide it, which recontextualizes the internal struggle and basically solves it. I wouldn't have minded seeing a greater look at this for Drake, as it could make him more than a wisecracking action hero, but he does get the chance to show off his determination. Of course, Drake isn't the only one to evolve in the game, as his semi-love interest gets some growth too. Elena at the beginning of the game acts as a great stand-in for the player, asking the reasonable questions like, are we going to call the authorities? How did these people find us? And it's clear that this treasure hunting life is both an unfamiliar and uncomfortable thing for her. Meanwhile, Drake is borderline accustomed to it. As the game goes on though, she becomes very much desensitized to the sight of bodies, to the point where her first reaction to seeing a dead body in a trap is thinking, I wish I had my camera.
That's disgusting. Oh, I wish I had my camera.
She even convinces Drake to continue when he feels like backing out, and I like this scene a lot.
Fine. It's me, okay? I am quitting. Are you coming or not?
So that's it. You're just gonna forget about the treasure and forget about Drake?
God damn it, this is not worth dying over.
Okay. Listen, either way, we have to head back to the harbor. Don't worry about it. We can argue about it later. It'll be great.
At the beginning of the game, Drake is the one initiating the exploring and saving Elena, but on far more occasions throughout the game, once Elena is all in, she's the one doing the saving and pushing forward, even when shooting a grenade launcher with one hand on the back of a jet ski. Elena is a strong female character that is a badass without feeling pandering or disingenuous. She has similar flaws to Drake in that they both get way too caught up in this treasure hunt, and her reliance on her camera is, as someone who makes videos, genuinely relatable on a slightly embarrassing level. Her chemistry with Drake is also great, and I'm very happy with the foundation for their relationship that carries over to the other games. The villain Roman was not my favorite. He serves as the basic rich, greedy villain, but I think what makes it worse is that Navarro just comes in as the main villain after Roman dies, and it just felt really disjointed. There's a few scenes with the two that justify Navarro's motivation to want Roman dead, but I still felt that it could have been better if Navarro's transition from sidekick to main villain was smoother and perhaps more telegraphed. I also like Eddie Raja a lot, but I felt his significance to the plot was pretty well non-existent. I feel like Navarro could have easily filled his shoes in the fort, and it would have made him more prominent in the story as a whole. Though I did like Eddie far more than Navarro. I think the twist with El Dorado being a curse was good enough, and hot take incoming, I think the Descendants tonally fit fine. I think this is because a supernatural twist is added in every Uncharted game, and it's a decent enough way of raising the stakes. Though I do admit that the whole World War II German bunker was a lot. While the game certainly follows this theme of being a dumb action plot, it's not like it lacks any nice details. The game's opening scene shows a stone coffin being raised from the ocean, and the game's closing scene shows a golden sarcophagus being drowned in the ocean. Both the opening and closing scenes take place on a boat, and the game seems to go to pretty great lengths to check off all the cliches of an action blockbuster, though as mentioned, a ledge breaking away or a bridge collapsing is so common that it almost gets tiring. Almost. I think the story overall works fine. It wasn't any masterclass in character writing, nor was it as memorable as the other game's stories, but it did what it needed to, and it gave the player a consistent excuse to keep going. I think that sentiment is shared throughout the entire game too. This idea of not necessarily doing anything exceptional in its field, but doing everything good enough to justify the price of admission. Uncharted Drake's Fortune is the embodiment of the very phrase that is shown at the beginning of the game, as if Naughty Dog knew that this game would spawn sequels marginally better than their predecessors, and as if they knew that this game wasn't the ceiling. It's like a meta commentary. That's not to say this game is bad though, in fact I liked it a lot. I think this game's biggest weakness though is just how bad it looks compared to every other game in the series, which improved upon every facet while also making the set pieces even more over the top. The story was simple, the presentation was good, but it felt repetitive as you trudged through way too many muddy forests. And the gameplay was definitely clunky, but it still worked, and considering the time this game came out, I'm actually surprised it holds up as much as it does. That's something I have to clarify too. This game, considering the time it came out, is great, but it doesn't really really hold a candle to the games of today, and that's expected. I mentioned that this game to me is best enjoyed by turning your brain off, and maybe that's a poor choice of words, but what I mean is that this game works best if you just don't question things too much. Don't worry about how Elena found Nate and Sully, or how a journal was able to stop a bullet, or how after being hit with said bullet, Sully just decided to lay there and pretend to be dead. Just sit back and enjoy the ride. I think this is why the game seems to have a bit of a divided player base. If you are someone who plays games for the challenge and mechanical depth, then I think this game is not going to satisfy you. But if you're looking for a laid-back experience, then you'll probably get the most out of it. In my personal opinion, not every game needs to be looked at as high art, and I don't mean that as a way of dismissing any criticism to this game, because I believe those criticisms are valid, but I also feel that the issues here don't prevent the game from being good, and more importantly, being enjoyable. But it does prevent it from reaching its full potential. I think Uncharted Drake's Fortune, while definitely the weak link of the series, is worth playing for at minimum seeing the beginning of what turned into a legendary series. I haven't played Uncharted 2 since its re-release on PS4 in 2015, and I am more than excited to see how much the series has improved since its humble beginnings. You know, there was a pretty long period of time in my younger years where I held the opinion that Uncharted 2 Among Thieves was the greatest game ever made. And think about that, there are so many incredible games that came out in the years prior and in the same year, and yet I was convinced that Uncharted 2 was the best. And I wasn't the only one who thought this, and some even held this opinion for years after, as Among Thieves has a reputation of being the greatest Uncharted game out of the series. But why? Are those people correct? Well, it's been a significant amount of time since I revisited Uncharted 2, and for those who are new here, I've already covered the first Uncharted in a different video, and I recommend you watch that first. For those who just want the Cole's notes, I essentially really enjoyed Uncharted 1, even if it didn't age very well, like, at all. It held up nicely considering its 2007 release, and it's a fun game with a solid gameplay loop, and while there are plot holes and gimmicks that overstay their welcome and graphics that wear its age on its sleeve, it's still worth playing if you're an Uncharted fan for experiencing the series' roots, if not for the nostalgia. I'll be honest, when I went back to Uncharted 1, my expectations were pretty low. But for this game, I'm expecting something killer. Sort of. I'm also expecting the disappointment, as the veil of nostalgia clouding my vision is bound to dissipate. Uncharted can be a really interesting series to cover because it highlights the kind of player you are. Some players value freedom, a good story, and deep mechanics over just being taken for a ride, keeping your hands in the vehicle at all times. Overall though, I found that Uncharted 2 Among Thieves was great, and despite its flaws that it has, this interactive action flick is easily worth revisiting. Just to get some housekeeping done, a lot of you mentioned in my Uncharted 1 video that there were certain glitches and gameplay quirks that were exclusive to the PlayStation 4 release of the game. And I want to clarify that I am playing all of these games on the PlayStation 4 through the Nathan Drake collection, which provides Uncharted 1, 2, and 3 with better fidelity and a consistent 60 FPS. I use this version because it's the only one I have, and there's a good chance that if any of you were to finally give these games a go or just replay them, you would likely purchase the remaster as well. I believe it's the best version, and of course the most accessible, with it being fairly priced and consistently going on sale. Something those of you keen viewers may have already noticed is the gameplay, and more noticeably, my aim. I'll be honest, okay, over the last few months I've been gaming on PC and using either a keyboard and mouse or an Xbox One controller, so I've been incredibly rusty. On top of that, the PS5 controller just doesn't fit very well in my hands because of how bulky it is, and I also shattered every bone in my hand before getting footage while saving a stray cat. Okay, maybe that last one was a lie, but excuses aside, the point is, some of the early game footage here will raise a few eyebrows, and I know. I'll also be showing late game spoilers because let's be real, I want to get this aim off the screen as soon as possible. So, spoilers ahead, for both Uncharted 1 and 2. So something the first game had down pat was the presentation. From lush jungles to ancient tombs, the environments were eye candy, and the remastered frame rate, which runs at a smooth 60 FPS, helps the game keep its age as ambiguous as possible. This is no different in Uncharted 2. And I think actually it looks even better. When I said this game looked better, I was being a bit misleading, because while the game does look good, it is only during gameplay, as the cutscenes here and certain assets didn't seem to get the same polish as noticed right away from the cutscenes. Take a look at this cutscene. It looks pretty good, right? Well, now look at this one. Notice that the darker parts of the scene end up being a mosaic mishmash of muddy colors, and this compression sticks out like a sore thumb. Other things like the chapter titles that overlay the gameplay look equally compressed and lack fine edges, but at least with those you won't notice it very much. While we're piling on the criticisms with this game's presentation, we can look to the glitches here, which aren't really being criticized because I only saw one when escaping Flynn and it was too funny to bother me, and this was the only bug I encountered. Now that we have all these negatives out of the way, we can get to the positives, and judging by how much time we have left in this portion of the video, it seems we have a lot of ground to cover. Though it may not seem that way because aesthetically, this game looks much the same as the first. But presentation isn't all about good-looking textures and that iconic theme song. The music all over this game is great, and something I appreciated more was the lack of music in some cases. It seems that the team took specific measures to make sure scenes weren't crowded with instrumentals, and in a lot of cases, hearing nothing was what built any fear. Fear they conducted with the visuals too. For a great example, look at all the Yetis in the Himalayas and Tibet. You wander around hearing strange sounds and feeling like you are not alone, and as you climb, the foreground sees a supernatural creature rearing its head right towards the camera, and I promptly peed a little bit. In all seriousness, I still remember the first time I saw this, and I was genuinely spooked to see the silhouette in the darkness, which is where it needs to stay if it were to stay undetected, as its jet black fur contrasts against the white, gray, and blue environments, of which there are plenty. A majority of this game takes place in the white of the snow, and is surprisingly never too bright or bland, which I appreciated, and it helps make the explosions and enemies pop a lot more, which some of the more colorful environments like Nepal can struggle with barely. Regardless, I greatly appreciate the diversity of the environments here and how they are used within the narrative. We begin the game literally in a cold and sterilized environment with bloodied clothes, and upon entering our many flashbacks, we see more vibrant locales, with even those that can't afford such lush color palettes at least having colorful dialogue peppered in. The second environment you visit, again during a flashback, acts as a bit of a flashback for the player as well. It sees you running through the jungle with Sully by your side, taking down mercenaries and chatting about hookers in a church. Classy. It feels like a proper revisit to the gameplay loop of Uncharted Drake's Fortune, and it reminds players that Naughty Dog knows exactly how to make those environments, and instead of retreading that ground, they make the riskier and ultimately more rewarding attempt to try something different. Sully ends up ditching Nate after these chapters, and we spend time with Chloe and eventually Elena, who occupies a lot of the game's latter half, and she too flirts with a revisiting of the first game's themes. The way her and Nathan almost get into an argument about Elena wanting to assist Drake, but Drake being concerned of her safety, is mentioned, but shut down about as quickly as it comes up with a swift verbal strike from Elena.
Shut up, okay?
That's actually part of what makes trudging through these different environments so entertaining. Nathan Drake is never suffering any separation anxiety, and the way him and his allies bounce dialogue off each other is just as charming as a cigar-smoking Sully is. Within this flashback with Sully, the game makes use of yet another one of its features, or lack thereof. When entering a tomb in Borneo, Sully, Nate, and Chloe have to find the path to a clue, but instead of following a trail of bodies, completing a puzzle, or just plainly searching, the game opts to use flammable resin, which illuminates the color of the blood, allowing you to get intrigued by the mysterious trail, as well as by the chatting of the group. The point I'm trying to make is that there often isn't a dull moment, and when there is, it's for a good reason. Like when entering the present predicament again. It gives the game a chance to, excuse the pun, ice the player and rip them from such fun environments straight into the frozen near death of the present. Spending a majority of the game's latter half in such old frozen wilds and barely standing monasteries makes the eventual arrival at Shambhala even more awe-inducing, as you've been relatively desensitized leading up to that point. The aforementioned monastery is a lot of bricks, mud, and more snow, and even leading into the underground, there's a lot of brass, brown, and black, but when the golden gates open, you are flushed with color and vibrance. Even the enemies here have some purple skin instead of the usual shades of gray. Well, that's about all that's new as far as presentation goes. Everything else is on the same level as the first game, though cutscene animations do look a little smoother. I think the diversity in the environments are what make all the difference in gameplay here, as the before mentioned Nepal served as a great set piece for some urban warfare and helped Drake feel like a fish out of water, or in this case, a fish out of jungles and caves. The jungles and caves that are here look just as good as they did before, and the final setting of Shambhala really hits a high point. As for cutscenes, the cinematography is far better here, and the shots are used in perfect tandem with the score to convey the proper emotions, which lends itself well to the story, which I also felt was far better. But for now, we can look towards what happens in between all of this. The gameplay here, much like a lot of things in this game, doesn't feel like a major departure from the mechanics seen in Drake's Fortune, but the little quality of life changes and the added layer of polish make the gameplay far more enjoyable and consistent in strangely every area except for where it arguably matters most, the gunplay. The shooting here overall feels really good, especially compared to Uncharted 1. The aim assist is a little stronger, which can cause some targeting issues, but as long as I'm not shooting at something that isn't shooting at me, then it can be excused. Ammo is something you'll be scrounging around for frequently here, as each weapon has its own ammo associated with it, meaning an AK-47 can't use the same bullets as an M4 despite them both being assault rifles. I ended up enjoying this more because it forced me to use a bunch of different weapons rather than just one or two. The options for weapons are very familiar, though there are a few new additions like the FAL, which fires in 3-round bursts and has the ability to scope in. You can also use a riot shield, miniguns, turrets, and more. Taking down the new enemies here is the exact same. Just keep shooting until they stop moving, though I did feel like shotguns were especially ranged in this game. The addition of new guns was never something I cared about anyways because they were never the main appeal of the combat. What did appeal to me was the things you did with the guns. Uncharted 2 takes the tried and true gameplay loop of the first game and turns it up to 11, and while this sometimes works really well, it can also lead to moments of frustration where it seems that player enjoyment, or the player's desire for it, was not really taken into account. This is mostly due to the enemy placement, and to explain what I mean here, let's look at this particular scene where there are 2 large minigun enemies that are borderline invincible unless they eat around 3 shots from an RPG. This is one of the more vertical sets, so we'll have an advantage of attacking from above, but there's an issue. If you're playing an action hero flick and you see a minigun on the ground, you are bullshitting me if you're saying you aren't beelining for it. The problem is, when you're holding the minigun, you are heavily slowed and you can't take cover, with the obvious trade-off being that you shred just about everything in front of you. The issue with this particular set is that this is one of the few points in which I can get my grubby little hands on this thing, but it's at the bottom of the arena, with a lot of enemies coming topside. So you expose yourself to infinite angles just trying to get to the thing, and because you die so quickly with that many goons riddling you with bullets, I couldn't use it and instead had to resort to staying behind cover and briefly peeking with my pistol. I then thought that perhaps I was intended to bring this into the next room, but no. You have to climb into the next area, which makes you drop the gun. There are moments similar to this later on where a minigun is in a hard to reach spot, such as in Shambhala, and it took a few tries to get into position to turn the tides, but the difference is that the level design allowed for me to make use of the different angles and succeed, whereas this one didn't. Another area where I felt the warfare layouts were not up to snuff was during the tower ascension in the monastery. Ascending the first tower was pretty good both stealth and combat wise, but descending down the second tower became tedious as enemies were able to hit you and spot you from unknown angles, making stealth borderline impossible without multiple resets, and the open combat was annoying for the same reasons. But this was another one of the few times that this was a problem. Another layout I want to draw your attention to is located right outside of the entrance to Shambhala, which has a ton of spots for cover. When you first enter this area, you have to take down an underwhelming handful of enemies, and because of the amount of cover, I assumed that there would be a bigger fight on the way back, and I was correct. But the fight had already taken place, and we can tell who won. I like this slight subversion of my expectations, and it works doubly for showing the player how deadly the Yetis are. Other than the 2 mentioned earlier, the layouts of the levels here are great as far as gunning about goes, rewarding the player for good positioning, ammo scavenging, and proper aim most of the time. When you're pumping enemies full of lead, you'll likely try to go for the head as it does more damage. Though something to consider here is bullet spread. And yeah, I know I harp on these mechanics, and to be fair, they pop up in a lot of third-person action games, the first and future Uncharted games included, but man, they really kill some of the more tense set pieces here. So many times I would take unnecessary damage due to my reticle being right on an enemy and it just going borderline around them. And it felt like the bullet spread never worked in my favor, and when it did, it was when I was inaccurate. This ended up being the most tilting part of this game, and while it never cost me major deaths or frustration, the mild annoyance was near constant at points. I know I'm gonna see some comments saying, oh, you're just bad at the game, so on screen right now is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Also, lowering the difficulty, of which there are many options, does not remedy this, as it isn't the damage taken that annoyed me, but rather the reason it was taken in the first place. One half remedy that works is just aiming for the body, because if at proper range, the bullet spread no matter what will hit the enemy, and while it does use more ammo and time to take them down, this way it's far more consistent. Other issues like those in Uncharted Drake's Fortune, where I was shot despite being behind cover and even being shot while the enemy was behind a wall out of sight, have thankfully been fixed as far as I'm aware, which is great. Aside from that which was mentioned above, combat is largely the same as far as gunplay goes, and I think that's okay. I mentioned in my Uncharted 1 video that the gameplay is excusably simple as it acts as scaffolding to hold up the greater set pieces of the game, and the same is true here. But the set pieces are far better, with some seeing you jumping from exploding car to exploding car, shooting enemies with guns, grenades, turrets, and others see you running away from an armored vehicle while shooting it, and even more see you running through collapsed buildings. More on that one later. But the best scene by far is unlucky number 13, the train sequence. Let's be real, I know the train level, you know the train level, everyone knows the train level, okay? So let's not dwell on it for too long. We all know it's great, and it still amazes me that this was pulled off in 2009, as it all flows so well from one environment to the next, having to position yourself from either on top of or inside the cars to avoid not only soldiers on the inside, but the obstacles on the outside was downright brilliant, and it's arguably the peak of the series. One of the encounters at the end of this train segment is against this green man, whose name is Draza, but the game barely mentions it. Regardless of any trouble remembering his name, you'll probably remember his boss fight, and now that I think about it, that's a bit of a stretch, because this guy is more of a walking meat shield that, while eating enough bullets to die from downright lead inflation, can waste you in just a few. I know boss fights have never been a strong suit for Naughty Dog, but this was proper ass. The arena is a train car, and you have 2 boxes for cover, on top of the framed entrance. One of the boxes puts you too close to him, as his gun will likely kill you from that range, so you really only have 2 pieces of cover. This guy, on top of doing and taking too much damage, has nothing that separates him from any other enemy, and the fact that he rushes you makes this so much worse, as you'll often be put in a position where you're cornered and have to make a break past him, which often leads to death. Eventually, when you do enough damage to him, he'll bomb rush you to close the gap with hand-to-hand combat. And if his health is low enough by the time that happens, he'll go down like a normal enemy. And if his health is too high, then a simple right hook will be your end. If I'm being honest, this isn't as bad as the Navarro fight at the end of Uncharted 1, but damn if this wasn't an exceptionally poor way to end an otherwise near-perfect sequence. More cover and making his AI less inclined to rush you would be a great way of improving the fight. But if you really want an easy way to make this fight more fun, just let us hop out the windows. In almost every train card leading up to this point, you can hop out of the train window to reposition. How about in this fight, we allow you to do that and make it an integral mechanic. Allow Draza to rush you, forcing the player to get some shots in while they can and then hop out a window. Then allowing you to shimmy to the other side of the car, flipping the arena and putting more distance between you and the green meanie. Better yet, throw a bunch of obstacles on the tracks that the players have to climb out of the way of, making use of your climbing skills under pressure. Fortunately, the second and actually final boss fight is against Lazarevich, and it is better. But not by much. The one thing Lazarevich has over Draza is the concept. Lazarevich, after consuming the resin from the Tree of Life, is near invincible and can't be taken down through the use of too many bullets, making him in fact the only enemy in the game that can't be killed through weapons alone. You instead defeat him by shooting the clumps of resin that cause a dense explosion 12 times! You play this game of cat and mouse with him 12 times before it's over, and while compared to Navarro, it is nice that the player controls the pace of this fight. The way you damage Lazarevich does not change, and even at his halfway point where he begins throwing grenades, merely forcing you to make a quick detour, doesn't change much by and large. And those grenades, much like his shotgun, are one of the ways he can very, very quickly kill you. The grenades in particular can be frustrating because they're thrown often when you aren't looking at the boss, and if you are running in one of the 4 corners of the arena which acts as a funnel, then you are more than likely to be pinned, leading to you either dying to the grenades or to Lazarevich's shotgun. This isn't even without mentioning that if you die after hitting him 11 times, you will have to do the whole thing over, and the worst part is, this isn't even a hard fight. It's just tedious, nauseatingly repetitive, making me let out a sigh of relief and say thank God when it was finally over. This fight had an interesting idea, but it needed more depth and less tedium. Make Lazarevich go down a maximum 9 hits, and make sure for every 3 hits a new wrench is thrown in your takedown plan, like the 4 grenades. I can at least say an additional challenge they add is having parts of the map collapse, forcing you to take different paths and run, jump, and climb away from Lazarevich. For now though, avoid climbing if possible because it was common for Drake to grab the corner of a ledge and sit there unwilling to climb up. And that's so strange too, because the movement here felt so much more polished in every other part of the game. I felt on multiple occasions that the movement was imprecise in Uncharted 1, and while there are a few moments like that here, they were truly few and far between. To be fair, some of them were due to pure inaccuracy on my part, and I only mention that so I have an excuse to show this clip where I completely missed a jump with excellent confidence. Unfortunately, a complaint I heard a lot with this game was that it was sometimes tough to distinguish the climbable parts of the environment from the non-climbable. I gotta be honest here though, I just don't see it. I was pretty easily able to figure out what to climb, and if I couldn't, it was pretty easy to just find it by throwing myself against different objects. This issue showed up for most people, most notably in Nepal, as it is very urban, and while some protruding bricks in most areas look noticeable and indicate something meant for climbing, in an urban war zone, this is less so. Still, I think climbing on things like signs and protruding architecture was normalized by this point in the game and even in the series, so it came naturally for me. I also enjoyed attempting to find the way forward in these scenarios because it often led to a treasure, giving me another hit of dopamine. These treasures can unlock different skins, secrets, and gameplay modifiers that make repeat playthroughs a lot more fun and interesting. I just wish more games these days did this kind of stuff. You can even equip the new tranquilizer weapon through this menu, which can allow you to silently take down enemies. While this particular weapon is used very scarcely within the campaign, your fists show up time and time again when engaging in the new stealth mechanics here, moving from cover to cover and pressing square when near an enemy to perform a myriad of takedowns, but for the time and even to this day, it's perfectly acceptable. I appreciated that the stealth here was challenging but also pretty forgiving in a lot of cases, especially those in which getting spotted is an instant fail. You may notice that a lot of the encounters here actually can't be done entirely through stealth, and that's fine. The stealth here is best used for thinning out the numbers and taking down any foes that could be a pain in the neck when in open combat. As shown with the 2 minigun enemies, stealth can also be used to put yourself in advantageous positions with advantageous weapons too. I can't say too much about it because, like the gunplay, it's so bare bones, but it was a lot of fun, and I'm glad this returned in future games. I think allowing us to go through entire sections with stealth alone could have been cool, but I understand why they weren't going for that in a game like this, where explosions and gunfire are meant to take center stage. If you do get into open combat and don't have a weapon, then you can engage in the reworked hand-to-hand combat. In Uncharted 1, the melee combat was pretty janky for me and relatively inefficient compared to just shooting, so I avoided it where possible. Here, you just mash the square button and occasionally press triangle to secure a beatdown, and it works fine. It wasn't mind-blowing, but again, it's a feature and an option I'm glad made a return to future entries and saw further refinements. So talking about the individual elements of gameplay is fine, but where Uncharted really comes together is in its execution of its set pieces. I mentioned that the gameplay, despite being basic, is excused because you're never doing just that. You're never doing just shooting. It's shooting with an interesting weapon, or on a platform mid-mudslide, or on a train, moving vehicle signs, you get it. There's a lot of variation. In between these set pieces, there's bite-sized action to keep you stimulated, such as a floor or a bridge collapsing under your weight, but these moments lose a lot of their luster very quickly. The issue I had with them is that you always knew when they were coming, except for this section on the bridge, and I'll explain why this works so well, but instead, let's look at other cases where they didn't have the same success. Let's look at this train car. There's no way forward, to the left, right, up. When you are funneled into an area like this, you're expecting something to go wrong, and most would expect, because the car is elevated, for the floor to collapse. And that's exactly what happens. Of course, this is going to be an issue on multiple playthroughs, but this shouldn't be an issue on the first. I know this may sound nitpicky, but if you played this game, then you know that finding issues with the gameplay is grasping at straws to begin with. Anyways, I think a solution to this is to offer a proper path forward. It doesn't have to be complete, however, in the train car instance, it would go a long way if even a door or an exit was added. It would bring more tension to the scene because then the player is genuinely getting thrown off track and not instead going exactly where they're supposed to. In the case of the bridge from earlier, I think this works well because you have a way forward, and because Elena is moving forward as well. It makes its collapse truly unplanned, and almost dying from a fall should never be part of the plan. You shouldn't be able to just open up your journal and have the next event shown to you, and the same goes for the solution to puzzles. In the first Uncharted, I had a pretty big issue with the puzzles, as they were all simple and took no forethought or thought at all actually from the player. You often just open your journal and the answer was presented to you, and the puzzle just consisted of a few seconds of quote-unquote solving the puzzle, and then a minute or two of actually executing the solution. Here, I unfortunately have to report that they didn't get much harder. They do ease you into things quite quickly, which I can commend, as the first few tasks ask that you simply do things like look up and follow lines, which teaches you to analyze your environments. Any puzzles after, however, don't take advantage of these lessons, as again, they are solved by just taking a peek at your journal. The only upside here is that the puzzles aren't as frequent, but they still take a considerable amount of time to complete after being given the solution. There was at least one mid-combat puzzle that I enjoyed a fair bit, which was when a minigun-bearing enemy was on top of some logs. We can shoot the straps on the logs to cause them to roll off the train, and subsequently the minigun enemy. In other cases, like one where you're stuck in a booby-trapped room, there's all of this tension as the spiked roof collapses on top of you, and if having an open gear wasn't obvious enough, having a tutorial prompt telling you how to throw a grenade is about as close as we get to the game basically playing itself. Funnily enough though, this grenade solution didn't even work and I had to use my guns to break the gears. Now, I could have turned these hints off, but I liked having them on because I want to know how the developers intend for me to actually complete the many scenes here. While Uncharted 2 on the surface is a linear game, it is actually far more linear under the hood. For example, take a scene where a tank is bulldozing through Tenzin's village and we have to keep up with the tank while also finding rockets to shoot at it. The problem that can show up here is that if you don't follow the exact path the game wants you to take, the level falls apart. For example, when I went to the wrong area, I was blown away by the tank, and when I respawned, I was on top of the building in which I died. This was where the game wanted me to be, but I felt disoriented as I was now in a seemingly new environment. Further on in the level, I arrived at a fork in the road and for some reason felt funneled to the left where the tank was, assuming I could hop inside it and take the gunner out. When I got close to it, I realized it could not hit me, and after a bit of fumbling around, I also realized that this is not where I was supposed to be. But before I could correct course, I was smited down. Within the same mission, there are similar inconsistencies that could pull some people out. Like when the tank is seemingly able to catch up to Drake no matter how far away he is, even at lightning speeds. But I just took this as a game acting as a movie in the same manner where enemies don't reload. Or when Nathan Drake in a borderline yelling volume tells Elena to be quiet.
Hey, shh. Alright, keep your head down.
It's just a video game thing, and it doesn't really affect a playthrough. In fact, it actually works in the game's favor a lot of the times. When you follow a scene the way the game wants you to, there's a constant stream of explosions, action, bullets, and that's where the game excels. Take the helicopter chase within Nepal. Everything in this scene, because I followed where the game intended me to go, worked perfectly and ends up being one of the most memorable scenes in the game for me. Jumping from building to building as each collapses behind you to eventually escaping a collapsing building as a helicopter has constant pressure on you was exceptional. It also highlights a fun mechanic where characters react to where you go, as Chloe exemplifies when I, for some reason, tried to enter the elevator of a collapsing building.
No, not the elevator.
Good point.
This entire sequence is just a chef's kiss if I've ever seen one, and there are so many like it across the series. It's incredible that Uncharted 2 can feel so different and like such a step up from the first game despite having so many similarities with it. Things like Drake and Sully and eventually Drake and Elena moving through jungle environments and even the end of the game introducing supernatural stakes and enemies are all things that we've seen before. There's even a callback to the first game's final act as you briefly pick up an MP40, which was introduced in the latter third of Uncharted 1. Unfortunately, something that has received a lot of criticism across the series has been its story. And I'm even guilty of that, as I criticize the story in Uncharted 1 for being perfectly fine on the surface, but the moment you begin to ask questions, the plot starts crumbling away. And the same is true here. The narrative in Uncharted 2 is basically the same as the first game. Drake and friends have no money and begin to hunt for an ancient long-lost treasure where trouble is amuck, as a very wealthy and powerful villain is after the same thing. As the two parties race to the treasure, one usually being right behind the other, it's revealed that the treasure has supernatural properties, leading to an epic conclusive fight between Nathan Drake and whoever the big bad is, resulting in Drake deciding that the treasure is simply too powerful to be left in the power of humans, and he discards it while ending up with Elena and Sully for a happy ending. In case you've forgotten, I'm talking about Uncharted 2, and you probably have forgotten because that summary applies to the first 3 Uncharted games and even, albeit to a lesser extent, Uncharted 4. Perhaps I'm doing a disservice to the game here because Uncharted 2 actually has some great moments, and I think the story here is good, but let's not pretend it isn't much like any other blockbuster film sequel, basically the same plot as the first. But again, that doesn't stop the characters and mystery of Shambhala from being engaging. The plot begins with Nathan Drake nearly dying from a train wreck, and as we move through the wreckage on near death, we experience flashbacks of how he got there, which is through the help of Flynn, a treasure hunter who enlists Nathan's help in order to locate a lamp for a well-paying client, promising fortune and the help of the best driver in the business, Chloe, whom, judging by the expression on Drake's face, he's met before. As the crew breaks into a museum to steal the lamp, Flynn double-crosses Drake, leading to him landing in a Turkish prison, only to be rescued by Sully and Chloe, using the last of Drake's fortune from the first game to pay for his bail. Drake, initially untrusting of Chloe, is convinced to hunt down Flynn and the treasure, this time being motivated by both fortune and revenge. Chloe, however, still works with Flynn and the revealed mastermind behind the operation, Lazarevich, to drop intel for Drake. Sully and Nate then do some exploring, and eventually as Nate heads to Nepal to follow the trail of Marco Polo and runs into Elena, we get the idea that these two did not end on great terms. With her cameraman Jeff, Chloe, Nate, and Elena move through the city until receiving their next clue, but not before Jeff is shot and left in critical condition. The group continue moving forward but are cornered by Flynn and Lazarevich. Wanting to assert dominance, Lazarevich shoots Jeff and the two left standing make a break for it. Once back to safety, the crew realizes they have to save Chloe, and in order to, they chase her down to a train, and when confronting her, Nate is shot by Flynn, and in a last-ditch effort, Nate blows up the train car in front of him, causing the whole train to go off the rails, and that's where we get sent back to the present. After passing out in the snow, we're saved by a Tibetan man named Tenzin, who escorts us to Elena, who tracked us down, and a man named Schaefer, someone who went on the same quest that Drake did. Sending Tenzin and Drake to find the remains of his fellow soldiers, Drake discovers that the treasure within Shambhala can corrupt those who drink it, turning them into monsters. monsters. When returning to the village, it seems that Lazarevich has caught up with Drake, leaving him and Tenzin to secure it, and finding that Schaefer has been kidnapped. As Elena and Drake track him down to a monastery, they find him dead, and encounter Chloe, who gives Drake the key to Shambhala only on the promise that he takes Lazarevich down. Unfortunately, right as Elena and Drake are about to enter the hidden city, Lazarevich and Flynn catch up to them and force Drake to help them get in. As Drake and Flynn solve some puzzles, they discuss Flynn's fate and what will happen to him once Lazarevich has what he needs, with Drake explaining that his future doesn't look bright. Once inside the city, the group is immediately attacked by Shambhala's residents, and Nate and friends are separated from Flynn and Lazarevich. As Drake explores, he discovers that the treasure in Shambhala is really sap from the Tree of Life, and that Lazarevich plans to weaponize it. Before they can move further, Flynn, fatally injured by Lazarevich, has one final middle finger to give Drake, in the form of a grenade which puts Elena in critical condition. The crew decides to leave, but before they do, Nate decides he needs to stop Lazarevich permanently. He does this, but instead of killing him, Drake leaves Lazarevich to be killed by the inhabitants of Shambhala. Nathan and his allies escape, and then we fast forward to the Tibetan village, where Chloe and Nathan part ways, and Nathan and Elena end up sharing one of the most wholesome pieces of dialogue in the franchise.
You were at least an 8.
An 8?
You were a total 8.
An 8? Those guardian things were an 8.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, those were terrifying.
What's a 10?
Clowns?
Clowns over my death?
I hate
Clowns?
clowns. I hate clowns.
Oh my word. You thought I was dead.
So while the story is a lot more convoluted this time around and a bit longer, again, the individual characters steal the show here. Something that immediately stood out to me was that even though the story is similar to the first game, it's not like the writers have forgotten what happened in the first, and more importantly, what worked. To get an example, look no further than Nate and Elena. When they meet again, we see that things must have taken a turn for the two, as Nate doesn't even refer to her and Jeff as friends, just journalists. I immediately expected them to retread the forming of their amicability, which they do to an extent, but they don't forget the events of the first game. When they're in Nepal, there are 2 points in which Elena and Nate show that they have learned from their time with one another in the first game. The first is when Elena explains that she's coming to help Drake, and Drake instinctively says that it's too dangerous, but Elena shuts it down near immediately by just telling him to shut up. It's like she, acting as a voice for the writer, is saying, we've done this song and dance before, and we know this is a fight you aren't winning, so let's just go. Another moment like this is when Jeff is shot. Notice how Elena doesn't even bother trying to grab the camera, and when Jeff does try, she doesn't stop Nate from telling him to leave it. Letting go of the camera was something Elena had to eventually do in Uncharted, and while a detail like this is completely minuscule to the point of arguably not meaning much, I think it goes a long way for continuity within the story, and I appreciated it a lot. Elena and Nate even give references to things that haven't happened on screen. Like when devising a plan to get to the train, they have this discussion that hints at some previous communication issues.
Now I'm going down there alone.
Nate.
Wait, just listen. You never listen.
Nate has some equally enjoyable dialogue with Sully, though it is short-lived. I also wanted to mention that they directly reference Nate's luck in this game, which was nice to see.
Listen, I don't have your luck.
The dialogue between everyone was pretty good too, and they do a great job of filling in the gaps between the action and plot advancements.
From there, we're in. Yeah, in like Flynn, right?
What?
In like Flynn.
I don't get it.
Just give me a boost.
On the flip side of Nate and Elena, we have Nate and Chloe, which while not as good, did its job of entertaining well enough, though her constant side-switching to keep her cover with Flynn made her a character that I couldn't grow attached to, and she doesn't have that much development across the game. She is just introduced, and we're shown that her and Nate have a romantic history together, and while that works, I would have liked more. At least she gets some development during the story, but even then it's pretty minimal, as the most I could find was that during the Nepal chapters, she insists on leaving Jeff, seeing him as dead weight, which was pretty harsh, but by the time she is in the same situation with Elena, she makes sure that she is brought with them and even prioritizes her safety. But even this could have been just chalked up to her wanting to avoid the ensuing argument between her and Drake if she were to suggest leaving her behind. And perhaps because of how much Elena meant to Drake, she decided for his sake it was worth bringing her. A lack of development is unfortunately something that plagues a lot of the characters here, including the main antagonists this time around, Flynn and Lazarevich. Flynn was fine enough. His initial betrayal did come as a slight shock, and his constant condescending tone towards Drake was entertaining enough, but ultimately he, like a more enjoyable Navarro, was just the lapdog of the brains of the operation, Lazarevich. Lazarevich, while ultimately the same architect of older fellow with too much money and a lust for power, was far more memorable than the latter because he was more present. Lazarevich gets his hands dirty and is a constant threat, while Roman very consistently got others to do the dirty work for him. I think the biggest weakness for Lazarevich was that his motivations were purely power, but I feel like a criticism like that is a little mute because it can be argued that that's the point. Just like any big movie villain, he's meant to be an evil, all-powerful antagonist that the protagonist has to defeat against all odds. When you do take down Lazarevich, he makes a pretty interesting observation. He claims that Drake should strike him down since he kills so many others, and this entire line sent my mind into a frenzy as I recalled the endless discussions of Nathan Drake and killing. A discussion I'm going to subject you to now. There's this strange disconnect when playing the Uncharted games because they often paint Nate as the good guy, and morally speaking, he is. Sure, he is pursuing greed in most scenarios, but he definitely has a strong moral compass that trumps any desire for wealth. But the thing is, despite being seen as a good person, he slaughters a small town's population by the end of just one of these games. Some felt it strange that Nathan goes through all of these men, but then the game acts like these kills never happened. Most argue that kills in gameplay don't count, and even if they did, they were done in self-defense. Except some have argued otherwise by citing the many times Drake kills someone that was simply in his way, like this guy.
Sweet dreams.
There's a guy below you, there's a guy below you.
Except wait! He swims away. But this is just one example. I mean, there are plenty of other times where Drake will engage in battle, assumedly knowing that he'll kill people, so what does this mean? It means that the story here is pretty inconsistent, but if the very few kills and cutscenes are justified, then why does Lazarevich bring this up? Unless to say that the gameplay kills are acknowledged, which then begs the question, why is this guy not in prison? It's just one of those things the game doesn't have an answer for, and I feel doesn't necessarily need one. Again, in this game, much like in Uncharted 1, when you start asking questions, you realize the game does not have an answer for everything. For example, there's no way Elena and Drake just randomly encountered one another like this, right? How did Drake get spotted in Nepal, but not Chloe despite the two being attached at the hip? How did Elena track down Drake after the train? What are the odds that Drake wakes up in a village where the only English-speaking person is the person who could set Drake back on the right track? Why were the people of Shambhala wearing fursuits to scare people away when their base appearance is intimidating enough? Why is there a sky when Shambhala is underground? But again, like the first game, these questions don't really take away from the plot that much if you go in with the right mindset of being taken for a ride, rather than looking for exceptional storytelling. Now, I am not saying that you can't look for that, or that a story that does away with explaining everything is more valuable, but I'm just saying that Uncharted likely isn't trying to tell a deep, intelligent story, because if it was, I doubt they would fail this hard on 4 separate occasions. That doesn't mean the story overall isn't good enough here, I think it is. But I think the story is lifted up by the other assets of the game, allowing it to be much greater than the sum of its parts, much like the game and the product as a whole. I think Uncharted 2 as its own product is pretty great. Yes, its story may not have been the best, and its gameplay mechanically simple, but its presentation, dialogue, and set pieces are so fantastic, and they elevate the otherwise mediocre parts of this game much higher than they could be if they were on their own. As a sequel, however, I think Uncharted 2 is top-notch, as it took nearly everything that the previous game did well, and did it better and in different ways. The environments compared to the first game were different, but also done exceptionally well with more diversity and more depth. There was a certain amount of love that went into these environments, like Tenzin's home village, which features a ton of interactions, all of which aren't told to the player, making it even more endearing. The gameplay mechanics, while largely the same, have some small quality of life improvements like the more accurate climbing and wider range of weapons. Unfortunately, in the process of ironing out nearly every gameplay kink from the first game, a new, very impeding problem reared its ugly head, which is the gun accuracy. But with how solid the shooting is, it can be excused. The addition of stealth and further refinements to the hand-to-hand combat went miles for making the gameplay loop here more varied and fun. And while the puzzles here were much the same as the first, their increased rarity makes them far more tolerable in my eyes. The story obviously wasn't the best, but it had this charm to it that I think a lot of games can't quite capture. It's a ride that knows what it's trying to be, and while it doesn't land every time, it lands most of the time. It works far better than the first game in my opinion because it feels like more happens and we have a wider cast. But I think the evolution of Nathan and Elena's relationship was better in the first game just by virtue of it being the main focus instead of having half of their time together being taken up by Chloe. Finally, I think it goes entirely without saying that the action here is what really elevates it above the first game. Shooting grenades at a helicopter while on a rooftop, having an entire level set on a train, jumping from vehicle to vehicle to get to the front of a convoy is just so much fun, and while yes, the boss fights do weigh it down a bit, the overall package of Uncharted 2 Among Thieves is still great, and I think it goes without saying that this is worth your time and money. I mentioned that I thought for a long time that this was the greatest game ever, and I also remember being absolutely psyched for the release of Uncharted 3, Drake's Deception. Uncharted 2 is a game that, upon revisiting, held up well, and I really hope Uncharted 3 does that too. Looks like we're back with our old friend, the PS Vita, and I'm sure this will be a huge nostalgia trip for the 3 of you that actually purchased one. Sporting a solid selection of games like, anyways, okay, maybe the Vita doesn't have a ton of games, and maybe Gravity Rush is still confined to a wheelchair from carrying the system on its back. But if we look at the Vita's big sister, the PS3, and its major mascot Nathan Drake, it's no surprise that Uncharted got a Vita game. Now, something that makes Uncharted Golden Abyss different from some of the other games in its field is that it was built for the Vita and stayed there. Amazing Spider-Man is impressive for condensing an open world down enough to fit it on a handheld, but the frame rate makes it clear that it wasn't made for it. Liberation, which we already covered on the channel, was fortunate enough to get ported to other consoles, but Uncharted Golden Abyss, on the other hand, is lost in its very name. As in order to record this very video, I had to purchase a Vita, mod the shit out of it, and actually get the game, all to bring it to you at a low resolution with no audio. Point is, this game is relatively forgotten simply for the few people that grabbed it, and for how inaccessible it is nowadays. That doesn't mean it doesn't have a following, as, well, here I am making a video on it, but its following is likely to dwindle over time because of the expensive prerequisites to playing it. And this is a damn shame, as the game is surprisingly solid and in a lot of ways feels like a proper entry to the Uncharted series, innovating on some parts of the gameplay but being bogged down by certain shoehorns. It's these aforementioned prerequisites that encourage me to say that this is a game you can't play. I know, okay, you can, but most of you aren't gonna drop the 200 Canadian coins to pick up a Vita. Oh, and I can see the comments now, but Aqua, you could just emulate the Vita. And no, my poor Optimist, you can't, because like any first-party title, this game forces system-exclusive gimmicks down your throat like feeding vegetables to a toddler, and one of them is a puzzle where you have to hold your Vita up to a light source. And you can't emulate that. So here I am to tell you all about this game so you can play it vicariously through me. I'm sure this will surprise you, but the game actually doesn't play that bad. And it feels like an Uncharted game, which I think is important. The game's biggest downfall is the system it's on. The shooting here feels like Uncharted, for better or worse, but the main issue is these little thumbsticks. They're so small that precise aiming is tough, and this is coming from a proud owner of baby hands, so if they're too small for me, then they're definitely too small for some of you bigger fellas out there. The point is, it just made playing the game tough, and the aforementioned light source puzzle, which, by the way, barely worked, I had to put my phone flashlight up to the Vita's camera, means playing this on the PS TV is also off the table. With the 3 Uncharted games I've covered up to this point, I had the nostalgia for the games as I played them when they were released, but that isn't the case here. This is my first time playing this, and because of it being a bit more of an obscure title, I don't know what the general consensus was at the time, or even right now. All I can go off of are the mainstream outlets, and we know what kind of reputations those guys have. So let's take a look back at the game Lost in the Golden Abyss, and let's ask a few questions. Does this feel like an Uncharted game? Does it feel like a spin-off or a proper entry? Of course, is it fun? And who is this made for? Let's tackle that last one, because I'm struggling to find an answer, and I don't want to hear anyone say, Uncharted fans, cause no shit it's made for them, but I mean, what's the largest appeal of the Vita? Probably portability. Take a PlayStation 3 experience and play it on the go. Now perhaps this is me lacking creativity, but I can think of only a few places where I'd want to play a Vita game. The first is in bed. You're tired and you just want to doze off while finishing up a quest. The other is maybe while busing or skytraining to your destination. 20 minutes of downtime makes for a quick session, or alternatively a long car ride. One a lot of you are probably thinking about right now is when you're out with friends. I mean, look at some of these trailers. It shows people sitting in a lunchroom playing their Vita and eventually a group forming to play with them. Unfortunately, this doesn't happen in real life. Here's an anecdote for you. I used to work at a department store, and in the break room, a coworker of mine would always play his Nintendo Switch. Just mind his own business and play Breath of the Wild on his lunch break, and yet he was constantly belittled by coworkers for it, with people calling him a man-child, a virgin, and a loser for playing with what coworkers called a toy. Then, the next week, I brought my Switch to work, and I played on my lunch break right next to him. And guess what? I got mocked too. Look, I get it. It's 2022, and nerds are winning. Superheroes are becoming more popular and so are their games, but we are still not at a point where gamers can just mind their own business and engage with their hobbies in public, so I don't really feel like playing my Vita in public. It's not about being insecure about being a gamer, but I just don't want to deal with the bullshit. But I could see someone playing it on the bus assuming they don't mind the social repercussions. It makes sense, and in fact, Golden Abyss has 34 chapters, most being 10 to 20 minutes, which is perfect for those wanting a quick pick up and play session. The problem with this is the amount of gimmicks here that force you to move around, and in rather unflattering and disrupting ways. The light puzzle is a prime example. What if you're playing at night, or are not near a bright light source? To be fair, this is the only time the light source is used, but what about when you have to tilt the Vita near 90 degrees to not fall, or swipe like a maniac to defeat an enemy? I don't imagine that's easy when you're crammed next to someone on the bus. The same goes for when you're in bed or lounging around. I'm trying to chill out and possibly sleep, not tilt myself 90 degrees. I see this so much with portable consoles. They market the product for use in public or away from the ideal console, but then make playing that console the most distracting activity. This is less of a problem with Golden Abyss and more a problem with the console, I will admit. So why don't we try and answer another question I had, which was, does this feel like an Uncharted game? Most would say that it's called Uncharted, so of course it is, and I agree. Even if it's called Uncharted Fortunes and Frolics and Nathan Drake has to dance his way to the treasure, I'd say it's an Uncharted game just by name alone. But the point of the Vita and a lot of the games was to deliver the home console experience on a tiny device. So how well does Golden Abyss do this? Remarkably so. Keep in mind, this wasn't developed by Naughty Dog, but rather Bend Studios, though they were supervised by Naughty Dog. And this was developed alongside Uncharted 2 and some of Uncharted 3. This is why, while the game feels familiar, it doesn't feel like Uncharted 3, which had the tightest controls and gameplay of the starting trilogy. It feels more like Uncharted 1 than it does 2, but that is still impressive. Drake moves like he should, shoots like he should, and cracks one-liners like he probably shouldn't in most scenarios. There are a few moments and animations here that feel new compared to those that were ripped from Uncharted 1 and 2, and they certainly look a little out of place, but in motion you'll feel right at home. Golden Abyss has all the tried and true elements of an Uncharted game, from the guns, the enemies, the set pieces, and the platforming, and unfortunately the story as well. The only major difference between this game and the others is that it doesn't have a supernatural force at all. There's also, of course, the introduction of new characters Chase, Dante, and some general whose name I don't remember, and trust me, you won't either. This game takes place before Uncharted 1, so it has a lot of freedom to deviate from the usual suspects, and I appreciate that characters like Sully aren't even mentioned until over halfway through the game, as to let other characters take the spotlight for a bit. As far as gameplay goes, this feels like Uncharted 1.5. It has the jungle jaunting that the first game offered, but it has the set pieces and further refined movement from the second game. The movement, much like a lot of the gameplay here, is generally untouched, except there's a strange restriction placed on it here. The game doesn't let you make an incorrect jump, at all. If on a platform, the game will in some cases, not all, not let you just drop or jump off. You need to scale down a dedicated path, and even then you can't just drop from a ledge to the ground. You need to drop from the closest ledge to the ground, which just felt restrictive for no reason. There were also many points where the game just does the heavy lifting for you. When crossing platforms, you can just press X, and the game will make sure that Nate always ends up in the right place, which removes the challenge and subsequently the point of platforming. I'm not saying the other Uncharted games have been some Kaizo Mario platformer, but there was at least some area for the player to fail. Here, there isn't, and perhaps that's a nitpick, and besides, if you don't like it, then just don't do it. One of the gimmicks this game has, and this one is truly for no reason, is the ability to tap a handhold on the screen and Nate will just climb to it. I understand the idea behind it, and the climbing never really took any technical mastery to begin with, but why just allow us to skip it entirely? It seems to be a running trend with Vita games, like Liberation, which gives you the ability to just skip combat encounters despite the combat in the game being easy as hell to begin with. Another gimmick the climbing has shoehorned in is when a ledge breaks away or when Nate loses his grip, you have to swipe on the screen to catch yourself. It's completely unnecessary, but it didn't happen enough to bother me. And the same goes for the swiping to cut down some bamboo, or rope, or the swiping to open doors, or the swiping to defeat enemies, or the swiping to clean objects, or the swiping to complete charcoal rubbings, or the... Okay, I think you get it. Each individual use of swiping isn't overused, but there are so many contexts here that you end up doing everything short of swiping up on the screen to wipe Nate's ass. But I can forgive it, because there are things going on in between the swiping. But this is thrown out the window in the last few moments of the game. Spoilers ahead, but let's be real, if you haven't played this yet, you probably never will. There are two antagonists in this game, Dante and that general, and both of these boss fights are dealt with through a QTE, but not just any QuickTime event, but through swiping in different directions on the screen. It's terribly boring and pretty frustrating too. Against Dante, you have 3 X's that indicate the amount of times you can mess up before having to restart, which makes sense because these can be lengthy, and they are present against Guerrero. Yeah, that's his name, I remembered it now. But halfway through the fight, you lose all of your X's. This isn't a huge problem. Something to note about these fights though, and the Dante one before it, is that when the X's disappear from the screen in his fight, minutes earlier, it meant that the fight was over. In Guerrero's fight, this is not the case, so I let my guard down, only to miss a swipe and have to restart the entire thing. If you want an idea of how I felt in this moment, then you're in luck. The capture device I was using couldn't capture any audio, so to remedy this, I just had the Vita on through my microphone. So enjoy my reaction to losing and being sent all the way back to this near 3-minute fight.
Oh my fuck, are you serious? the whole fucking thing again.
So yeah, I wasn't a fan of this fight and the one preceding it. I don't understand why every possible device needs a touchscreen. Tap to climb, swipe to beat up. The only decent use of this is when swapping weapons. You can tap the gun icon to swap weapons on the ground, which worked, as did reloading. Keeping the grenades to the touchscreen worked too, but I wish they only let you throw grenades in combat, because the amount of times I tapped the check mark in the bottom right after solving a puzzle, which because of my screen not registering the tap I had to do multiple times, led to me accidentally killing myself with a grenade, and it was embarrassing. Many of the puzzles here also require your grubby little fingers. Some see you rotating and cleaning an object, others see you rotating and placing shards of paper to recreate an image, and others see you moving statues and spinning rings. In most cases, these were mild distractions that I actually liked a lot, or at least a lot more than the previous games. Specifically the one with the statues, as rather than pushing them around, you can just drag them on the touchscreen, making it way more convenient and interesting. Another thing here, and this is genuinely a step in the right direction for Uncharted, is that the puzzles take thought from the player. Let me give you an example. When in a cave with Chase, you have to find symbols that correspond to certain heads, which can be found on statues, and they tell you where they are, but you have to get to them on your own. Once you do that, you go back to the door and use the symbols you found to punch in the answer. The reason this was fun was that it required the player to actually do something. The answer wasn't in Marco Polo's journal. We had to find it. And in the other statue-based puzzle, you had to place them in specific spots. And again, the answer was not given to you. You had to actually figure it out. It was a huge step up from Uncharted 1 and 2, and about on par with some of the puzzles from Uncharted 3. But I'd say the variety makes this game have the best puzzles out of the trilogy so far. 4 is a different story, but we're not tackling that beast just yet. Eventually. I mentioned it briefly already, but the combat here feels familiar and just normal. I think previous criticisms here do still ring true, but they're even more noticeable than before. The reason it's more noticeable is because the shooting is generally worse due to the thumbsticks and controls. On top of that, the gyro controls don't offer as much precision as you'd think. Most gunfights when changing the difficulty just change how often you can peek from cover, and for how long you have to stay hidden. I also take issue with the reworked melee system. It's much the same as Uncharted 2, but now to do a takedown you have to swipe the screen twice, but it can be initiated by both the enemy and you. It's great when you initiate it, but when an enemy is close it'll automatically start, meaning shotgun foes that rush you will not only do damage as they approach, which is hard to stop given their armor, but they'll also initiate melee combat which pulls you out of cover, allowing all the other enemies to open fire as you are kept busy because once you start, you can't stop until the enemy is defeated. Going back to the armored enemies though, the best way to deal with them is to just throw a grenade, but the grenades were often hard to aim, and at times, my press on the screen wasn't registered. So when I'm in a tight corridor and have an armored shotgun enemy approaching me with 5 mercs behind him and I can't get the grenade to work, I'm dead, as the shotgun enemy has reached me and pulled me out of cover. I'd rather have the ability to just shoot enemies that are close instead of being forced to tap and swipe the screen in the most exposing manner possible. Before combat starts, much like Uncharted 2, you can thin the numbers through stealth. Though I felt that there was more scenarios here where the entire segment could be completed in stealth, which I appreciated so much. It's the first area where the game is actually better than some of its contemporaries. The story is also better this time around for lack of a supernatural force, and I really appreciated Chase. The game begins with Nathan Drake and an associate, not friend, named Dante looking for the lost city of Quivira, running into a woman named Chase and a drug dealer named Guerrero along the way. The usual hijinks ensue and we end up ditching Dante to work with Chase instead, and after narrowly escaping Dante and Guerrero, we find out that Chase's grandfather had been searching for Quivira, explaining Chase's motivations. We search for the city, finding Grandpa's dead body along the way, oops, and eventually Chase is kidnapped and Nate turns to Sully for help. They track down Chase and her and Drake discover the city, and discover that the City of Gold is radioactive. Drake defeats Dante and Chase on their way out and reconvenes with Sully for a happy ending. Chase was a great character, who seemed to be the only one able to keep up with Nate in both wits and historical knowledge. It makes their dialogue a specific kind of enjoyable, even calling out Nate's tendency to lecture his companions on what they're doing, offering a slightly meta lens of which to view the dialogue. Dante made me realize that Mark Wahlberg would play him perfectly, and Guerrero was, like Dante, so boring. The thing is, all the Uncharted games have been like this. So in one sense, this is a great version of Uncharted on handheld because Uncharted has always had shitty villains, and especially shitty endings. But in the other sense, I can't with confidence say this is a good thing. On repeat playthroughs, I'll be skipping the cutscenes, especially when some of them are upwards of 5 minutes? I know this is the most bitch-made criticism, and I'm aware that Metal Gear Solid 4 actually exists, but these cutscenes are just exposition dumping. And when this is seemingly built to be played in short increments, having a 5-minute cutscene that could be supplemented with dialogue that takes place during gameplay was so annoying. Not to mention that 2 chapters here are dedicated to only rowing a boat, which is done by, you guessed it, engaging with deep mechanics that require skill, and of course fucking not, you swipe the screen like a madman for minutes upon minutes. The plot overall has very little for me or anyone to really sink their teeth into. I know, deja vu, but I can appreciate the lower stakes here. It isn't some save the world plot. It's just Drake and Chase beating their adversaries to a treasure, and I'm glad they didn't try to do anything more than that. It had the arguably too familiar formula to it, with Drake moving from set piece to set piece with a companion, and when Sully is in the mix it feels one-to-one with its home console counterparts. The set pieces themselves are less so, but I wouldn't be surprised if the hardware is what held that back the most. The game's action scenes are never anything more than an explosion or a collapsing bridge, but anything more than that would likely kill the frame rate, which is already bad enough. There were points here where the frame rate felt like it was dipping into the sub-10 areas, I swear, and while I don't totally care about frame rates, especially on a handheld where so many compromises already need to be made, it got to a point where it made shooting even more difficult in some areas. So I think the answer is quite obvious here. This is a good Uncharted game. It even innovates slightly as you can swing on ropes, which we wouldn't see until much later, and the back eject now sees Nathan diving more often than not, which gives it a bit more flair. This game even has a mission similar to the jet ski mission in the first game, but this time it's on a rowboat and it was so much more fun. It's like a nice apology for the hell we were put through in Drake's Fortune. The only thing separating it from its family is the insistence on shoving the different gimmicks down our throat. And the cutscenes would be a lot more fun if we didn't constantly have this fight for fortune lower third. And now I guess I have to talk about it. A major letdown here is the collectibles. The collectibles in Uncharted have never been much to write home about, but the rewards were where the fun was had. Different outfits, guns, you name it, and yet here, we get playing cards that can be used in Uncharted, The Fight for Fortune. Look, promote the side game all you want, but when I do things in the game or nab collectibles, having Donut Drake replaced with a digital trading card puts me to sleep faster than So, barring a few things, the budget and over-the-top set pieces being a major one, this feels like an Uncharted game. And I would, for the same reasons I gave earlier, say that this is a fun side adventure, and a solid starting point for anyone wanting to get into the series. But does this spin-off feel like a spin-off? I know it might be ridiculous to ask that question, but I feel it's genuinely something I see a lot of these days. The worst spin-offs I can think of are Assassin's Creed Chronicles, because they deviate so hard from the normal gameplay that it makes it feel like a completely different game, and not a very good one mind you, with an assassin paint job. On the opposite end, we have something like Persona 5 Strikers. I know this game is new and popular, so the SMT fanbase has to hate it, but it does genuinely take the ideas present in 5 and build upon them with different remixes and mechanics. It makes it a game that, while still a spin-off, feels like a proper game in its own right. Uncharted Golden Abyss feels like a proper Uncharted game that at the last minute was given the title and subsequent treatment of a spin-off. The gimmicks here that involve all the swiping and touchscreen controls, if moved to a controller, would feel right at home. Unfortunately, these spin-off elements are likely what prevent this game from seeing a port, as it would likely take too much work, and nobody really cares enough about it. The plot here has no wider significance, and doesn't influence any of the other games, so even for those wanting to catch up on lore, there's little to offer. It could easily be thrown on the PS5 at 60 FPS like Liberation for $25-$30 price tag, and I'm sure many would be happy with that. Overall, Golden Abyss is a solid entry in the Uncharted series that was held back by the console it resides on. The environments and characters look great and delivered that 2009 graphical prowess, but it also brought along frame rates from 2077. The shooting was much the same, though stealth was surprisingly more viable here, offering more variety. The controls held this back more than anything, as the nimble thumbsticks and dodgy touch controls caused more deaths than I wanted to admit. The story felt right at home with its poor villains, fun dialogue, and forgettable premise, but ultimately the cinematic flair isn't recaptured assumedly from a lower budget and hardware restrictions. I harped on the gimmicks a lot here, but the problem was from the overuse of it rather than the actual gimmick itself. Infamous Second Son had plenty of gimmicks to show off the new DualShock 4, but they never felt intrusive, which is exactly what a gimmick should avoid. It won't be played anytime soon, because it just costs too much and the hassle isn't worth it. But if this game ever comes to PS Now, or God forbid gets a port, then I'd recommend it. But for now, this game will still have to be lost to the abyss. Uncharted and Nathan Drake are one of the most iconic faces in gaming. the face of the PlayStation going toe-to-toe with titans like Master Chief and Mario, and its evolution from its original title of Project Big to Uncharted was nothing short of magnificent. Ironically, this series that has since its inception been associated with the phrase greatness from small beginnings has been over the top from its first entry. The second Uncharted then came around and did everything the first game did but better, and any wrongdoings were corrected. While Uncharted 2 Among Thieves isn't perfect, it gets respectfully close. A reasonable question to ask after receiving a sequel that topped its predecessor in every single way is, how can they do it again? How can Naughty Dog possibly make another game that not only improves upon its last installment, but dwarf it in comparison? Perhaps Uncharted 3 is the answer. Uncharted 3 felt like it was truly metamorphosing itself into the kind of over-the-top media it was once replicating. Everything from the tease set pieces to the actual Subway advertisement.
Subway, where winners eat.
I don't know how this happened, but it's amazing and I will die on this hill. Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception's marketing was a hype I hadn't seen for a release before, and from a personal experience at the time, it felt like everyone had been looking forward to the next adventure with our favorite Dude Raider. But then, the game came out. Praised by some, citing its score, set pieces, and gameplay as high points, and lambasted by others for its poor pacing, plot, and controls. It was clear that Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception would prove to be the most divisive entry in the series. It is this very divisiveness that warrants a look back at Uncharted 3. It's been 11 years since its release, arguably plenty of time to mull things over and come down from the high of your hype being fulfilled, and come up from the disappointment. From a personal standpoint, I'm worried about revisiting this game because I loved it upon its initial release, and while I was significantly younger, I'm concerned with how this game will hold up under a critical lens. It's important to note that while I will be spoiling everything leading up to and including this game, if you would like to see my previous videos on Uncharted Drake's Fortune, a game that showed its age but was an acceptable nostalgia trip, and Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, a game that has a solid plot, some great set pieces, and gameplay but has a few fatal flaws, you can find them down below. For full context on my opinions, please refer to those videos. And now, let's take some time to revisit, reanalyze, and re-experience Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception 11 years later. Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception, while looking great for the time if played on the PlayStation 3, looks even better if played on the Nathan Drake Collection, which includes remasters of Uncharted 1, 2, and 3. I'm playing this on the remaster, so that's why this video will contain no mention of the multiplayer. I can at least say that what I played of it many years ago was fun, but wasn't something I returned to often, probably because all of my friends were playing COD instead of Uncharted. This entire video will be evaluating the remastered version of Uncharted 3 as it's the most accessible and honestly the best way to play these games. The remasters do bring in a few bugs that the originals didn't have, but the fidelity in the locked 60 frames per second makes a cinematic experience like this so much better. Uncharted tries to emulate a blockbuster action flick, and while gameplay reigns supreme in arguably every case, an argument can be made that presentation in Uncharted's case is marginally more important than it would be in any other game. Uncharted since its beginnings has nailed the look of a blockbuster film. The explosions, dialogue, aesthetic, and by the second game they further blurred the lines between film and game. This time around I'd argue that this is no longer a game emulating a blockbuster film, but a game that is part blockbuster and notably feels like one. The camera angles here are far more dynamic, the score more ambitious, and it allows scenes like the opening where we see the sewer lids as the protagonists walk, informing us of our location to prove that it is the next step. Of course, with a game that has a budget like this, a Subway budget, it's easy to tell that this is going to look better, but the art direction here also feels as though it evolved, though not to the point of losing its identity. We still get the same pull from the camera when climbing a large objective to take in the scope of our ascent. The castle walls from Drake's Fortune, the train wreck in Among Thieves, and now in Drake's Deception in moments like those when scaling the shipwreck instill that same feeling of being out of your depth. Uncharted 2 specifically made great use of camera angles in cutscenes, but here they make a greater use of different angles and shots both in and out of cutscenes. Uncharted 3 is also the most tonally diverse of the games in terms of environments. The first Uncharted focused on jungles and caves, with the second putting a greater focus on urban environments and snow-covered monasteries. Here we get a little bit of jungle, urban exploration in different locales, some cave rummaging, chateau raiding, and of course the third act of the game takes place in the desert, which is where the marketing would have you believe a majority of the game takes place. While you'll spend a majority of this game outside the desolate sands, the gameplay that does take place there utilizes the location to its fullest. The colors here are really incredible and screenshot worthy. The way the orange and pink sky cover the grains in a light that blisters down on Nate's skin is scenery that the previous entries could simply not achieve. Something Drake's Deception does is further blur the line between gameplay and cutscene. While the previous entries had notable but non-intrusive transitions, the elegance in the transitions here were arguably to the game's detriment, as there were many points where I did not realize that a cutscene had ended and I was actually lagging behind. Now, this is of course a problem with some, as Uncharted can at times seem like less of a game and more of a continuous QuickTime event requiring minimal inputs from the player. This is a sentiment present in every Uncharted game where the mechanics themselves are fundamentally shallow, but it's excused because the overall experience, the gameplay, action, and story, allow the product to be greater than the sum of its parts. The reason I bring this up only now is because with Uncharted 3's push to be the most cinematic experience yet, there are many points where there is a noticeable lack of control. There are still plenty of encounters that require button inputs and the like, but there are large portions and in some cases entire chapters that consist of just walking, pushing the stick. I personally don't mind this because I can see what Naughty Dog is going for here, and their attempts at creating these movie-like moments resonate with me. But if you are looking towards the Uncharted games purely for gameplay, then I think it's safe to say you'll be disappointed. If you go into this wanting a cheesy action flick with explosions and buried treasure, then like me, you'll be satisfied with the series and the improvements made here. While variety in the locales is good, I've also enjoyed the variety in characters, as playing as a young Nathan was one of my favorite parts of the game as a kid, and it is still an excellent flashback gameplay-wise, even if it isn't as relevant to the plot as it could have been. The rewards from before also return and allow you to replay the game as a number of characters, from Elena to Sully to Twitter users, and the list just goes on, and that doesn't even get into the other rewards here. It's something you don't see much of these days, so it's appreciated even more for its scarcity. Levels also see you in a number of drug trips, which from both a plot and gameplay perspective got old very quickly, and I'll touch on that more later, but for now, that's all that's new with the presentation, unsurprisingly. Fortunately, the gameplay this time around, much like the innovations made to Uncharted 2, don't reinvent the wheel, but they do go a long way towards making Uncharted 3 the best playing Uncharted game so far. The gameplay this time around is as tight as ever, with almost every single kink present in the previous game's controls ironed out, and with added innovations to boot. That's not to say it is perfect, but there were few moments in the game where the controls or the gameplay at all frustrated me. For example, if you remember, I criticized the bullet spread quite heavily in the first and especially the second Uncharted, for punishing a player that plays with accuracy and not allowing the player to shoot with much precision. Uncharted is as much an interactive film as it is a power fantasy, so having that fantasy interrupted by a bullet that decided to borderline curve around and pelt Nathan in the forehead was a point of contention for me. I'm beyond excited to share with you that the shooting here keeps its bullet spread, but it's much tighter, allowing for an inaccurate player to get lucky with a headshot or reliably shoot for the body, and a sharpshooter is able to feel unstoppable as they get headshot after headshot. I felt rewarded for my accuracy, and having such shooting in a game like this is even more important, as Drake's Deception throws everything in the kitchen sink at you, both for and against you. There are a few new tools at your disposal here, but they just function as reskins of previous weapons. The Cal 7 is the AK, the G-Mal the FAL, the M9 is the M4, and so forth. I don't really think Uncharted needs any brand new weapons, and whatever new weapons they did add would feel a little redundant anyways. As with previous games, you'll be swapping guns quite a bit to keep up with the limited ammo, and the ever-increasing series of enemies that are, again, nothing new. The brutes with shotguns, basic enemies, snipers, riot shields, they are all here. What stops them from feeling boring or repetitive is the context in which you fight them. Hanging from the vents of a broken down military ship, from the cargo of a plane, in the cover of a sandstorm, you are always shooting in interesting scenarios. The enemy placement though, and the sheer amount of them, can be a little frustrating at times, especially when considering how loud this game can be. Enemies are often trying to get behind you, which is quite smart, but they seem to be near silent when moving. And factor this in with the soundtrack that, while masterfully made, is booming in your ear just under the thumping of the bullets, and enemies can sneak right behind you without you even seeing or hearing them. When you're on normal difficulty, this is fine, but on harder difficulties, it means an enemy can kill you before you have time to process what's happening, let alone turn around and do something about it. This doesn't happen all the time, but when there are multiple enemies rushing you and others shooting you from afar, it can feel like you have no room to move, and this becomes trickier when the enemies have armor that practically absorb the bullets. There are just some areas that don't feel like they were built for this many enemies. To explain that further, let's look at a new enemy variant. I know I said there wasn't anything new, but I lied, because these enemies show up for about one chapter and that's it. The new foes, named the Jinn, are just normal soldiers, but instead of dying, they power up with flaming heads and the ability to teleport. They also get the ability to throw napalm grenades at you, which function the same as a grenade launcher does. When they are damaged enough, they'll progress into their next phase, which makes them stronger and even more aggressive. Uncharted is more or less a cover shooter. Sometimes it's actual cover, other times it's a ledge you're hanging off of, or a vent you're climbing, but in most Uncharted shootouts there is a large amount of cover. So this is why I'm dumbfounded as to why the game insists on putting 6 of these enemies in a room with less cover than normal and giving the enemy the ability to near instantly teleport behind you and throw a napalm grenade at you, which can't be thrown back like other explosives, which forces you out of cover. This from a design perspective just doesn't make sense to me because there's no trade-off. It's not like you're forced out of cover but you are given something that turns the tides back in your favor even a little. It's just an enemy that flat out ignores the fundamentals of the shooting. It doesn't even factor in their increased damage, which can eliminate you very quickly after you leave such precious cover. You might be able to argue that they give you a lot of explosives in these cases, which is true, but when the enemies can freely teleport away from said explosives, your best bet is to try and get a direct hit on them with a grenade launcher, which will cause an instant explosion instead of the usual cook time. And good luck with that. Even then, you have to hit them twice to finish them, and this particular enemy took upwards of 6 shotgun blasts point blank to go down. I know that this side rant isn't very relevant in the larger picture, as you only fight these enemies for about 20, maybe 30 minutes of gameplay, but it doesn't excuse an enemy that felt like it was designed to be as counterintuitive as possible. A potential remedy would be to just make the enemies weaker. Not in the amount of damage they do, but in the amount they take. Turn them into glass cannons. This can make your ideal way of defeating these enemies the run and gun method, which is how you dealt with the supernatural enemies in Uncharted 1. Nathan Drake's origins plays a large role in this game's theme, and having supernatural enemies that are reminiscent of the supernatural enemies within Drake's Fortune, his first on-screen outing, would fit in with this theme. There's also one more variant of enemy, but they don't play a role in the gunplay, but rather the now more in-depth melee combat. The hand-to-hand combat here features a few new elements like grappling and environmental attacks. If you grapple an enemy, you can either pummel or throw them. Throw them into a counter with a bottle, and you'll end up smacking them over the head with it, shattering it on their skull. The objects you can interact with will be tough to distinguish from the environment though. As in the kitchen of a bar, I assumed I would hit an enemy with a frying pan, which I did, but I also used a freezer door to take down a thug. I didn't mind these being a little difficult to find, but I don't know how many I actually found. I'd love to know which ones you found in the comments below. I know I saw one where Drake slapped an enemy across the face with a whole ass fish, which made me piss myself laughing, but I don't know what others there are. On the flip side, enemies can grapple you too, and you have to mash the circle button to break out. If another enemy approaches you, you can throw your legs up to counter them. The newest additions to the combat are the brutes, who take far more hits and can take you down in seconds. A proper method to disposing of these mooks is just proper button mashing, much like everything else, but I think the variety here is somewhat appreciated. You may remember that there's a hand-to-hand combat system in Uncharted 2, but there was little room to use it. I found that I was often in a position where I could maybe take out 1 or 2 enemies using hand-to-hand, but anything past that usually led to death. Here there are dedicated melee segments, and I think these go a very long way for replayability and variety in the gameplay. These were in fact some of my favorite parts of the game because while the concept is very simplistic, it is still done well and achieves what it sets out to do. I also appreciated that melee is now a greater method of starting an encounter, as defeating an enemy that has a weapon will now allow Drake to, in slow motion, grab the gun mid-air and transition from melee to range combat on the fly. In the first Uncharted, there were 2 sides to the gameplay, the climbing and the gunplay. By Uncharted 2, we saw the introduction of stealth in very specific contexts, and now with Uncharted 3, we have dedicated shooting, climbing, combat, and stealth, and these gameplay elements intersect with one another far more than it has before. The stealth additions here are actually minimal, but the enemy layout and the use of certain environments makes stealth something you can rely on if you don't feel your shooting is up to par. The most significant change I noticed is that they actually give you a viable stealth weapon. In the previous games, for one chapter, you had the tranquilizer and it barely worked from any range beyond 5 feet, but here the silence pistol allows you to eliminate those in your way from farther away, which completely changes how stealth is approached. You now don't have to get uncomfortably close, though that is still an option, even from an elevated position, as you can now dive onto someone, and while this is quite noisy compared to your other stealth tools, this works better than dropping behind the enemy and risking being spotted. The enemies here are quite forgiving in their detection speeds, making stealth something I used a lot to both thin numbers and completely bypass encounters. This is further possible thanks to the layout of the stealth segments here. One of the most enjoyable was at the Syrian Citadel because of one small detail. Not only is this section at night, which can obscure your position, but all of the enemies have a flashlight around their waist, and this is a genius way of giving the player the advantage as you can now see exactly where an enemy is looking. You can't tell their pathing, and a careless approach will still render you spotted, but these lights act as vision cones for the enemies, and it also means that we can see if someone is around a corner seconds before we're forced to make a decision. Of course, what's best about this is that it's completely optional. Almost every encounter in this game can either be done loud or quiet, and while these days it feels like every game takes this approach to scenarios, seeing it here is still appreciated. The movement here hasn't been mentioned because there is no notable changes so far. I do think that there's a strange amount of inaccuracy this time around. For example, every time I tried to step on top of the front of a car, I would perform the step up and then Nathan would jump off, and I could not figure out why this happened. There were also certain camera angles that made the distance you had to leap seem greater than your limits, but they weren't. They just looked that way because of the perspective. Certain things like Nathan not grabbing onto ladders mid-combat can be pretty frustrating, but it didn't have happen enough to ruin the fun for me. When the movement did work though, it actually felt the best and most fluid here. So while these are minor bumps in the larger journey, they're bumps nonetheless. But of course, we aren't here for the mechanical depth, and you guys know by now that the real bread and butter of this game is the set pieces, and man do they deliver here. I think there's a sense of deja vu when it comes to the scenes though, such as riding on horses to get to the front of a convoy. This time instead of jumping from car to car, it's horse to car, and instead of trying to save Schaefer, it's trying to save Sully. I can acknowledge that this is a very similar concept to the convoy in Uncharted 2, but it does enough differently, like the near opposite color palette that swaps ice and snow for sand and more sand, and of course the introduction of horses aesthetically does make this feel different, but mechanically it isn't. Of course, the convoys here don't even hold a candle to the cargo plane, which sees you fighting a brute on its open backside, eventually hanging on by the cargo itself and then being sent into the desert sky, only to be saved by a near supernatural stroke of luck. There are so many ridiculously dangerous situations that Nathan Drake gets into that it's almost strange when they don't happen. When climbing a pipe outside of the decaying chateau, I was more surprised that the pipe held rather than breaking like nearly every other pipe in the game. Granted, this is the only object to not be borderline disintegrated in this chapter, but either way, I think an argument could be made that the moments of a piece of the environment falling apart as Nathan climbs on it are too numerous. But even when a handhold broke as I expected it, it enforced a feeling of danger, even if that danger is scripted. Uncharted 3 is again a linear game, but I will admit that Uncharted 3 in some scenarios takes the training wheels off, even if barely. The aforementioned ways you can attack a room with stealth or a loud approach is just one of the ways, but there are also more linear moments too, like in the desert. I find it funny that the chapter that sees Drake in the most open area he has ever been is the one with the most restrictions and invisible walls, feeling at points on rails. I don't think this takes away from the scenes though, as the desert chapter still stands as a highlight because of its lead up and its execution, which truly felt ahead of its time. The thing that makes Uncharted 3 so much better than the previous games from a gameplay perspective is just how much variety there is. You're not in the same locale for very long, and things move along very quickly. While I did appreciate the more low-key moments in Uncharted 2, like the jaunt through Tenzin's village, the consistent action here is more enjoyable in my eyes. I play Uncharted for the explosions, the climbing, the danger, and this game just doesn't let up on that. The puzzles make a return here, and fortunately, I think they're the best so far. They won't stump anyone rubbing two brain cells together by any means, but I think the fact that it took more thought than simply opening your notebook for the answer is a step in the right direction. Furthermore, the execution of these solutions is short, so unlike the previous entries, you won't solve a puzzle in a few seconds and then spend a minute executing its solution. Using the light to cast a shadow on a portrait in Yemen was one of my favorites, and while it can be brute forced by trial and error, this perspective puzzle was more interesting than the usual suspects of turning a statue to face the right direction, which does show up here in the early game. Thankfully, the puzzle following this one sees you deciphering which symbols belong to what part of a grid, and it was an interesting way of using the environment to figure out a solution, having to stand on different parts of the floor with your torch to illuminate a different symbol. The puzzles are also rare, so if you don't like them, you won't be forced to interact with them too much. The other portion of Uncharted 3 that is far better than its predecessors is the lack of any real boss fights. There are some here, but they function more as quick-time events than anything else, and while on one hand I think removing something rather than fixing it can be a bad thing, in Uncharted's case it led to a more consistent experience. Navarro and Lazarevich were some of my least favorite moments from the first two games, and they made the endings feel underwhelming compared to everything leading up to that point. Here, Talbot is the most notable boss fight, and it truly boiled down to a quick-time event, and that works a lot better than the previous games, even if its potential is minimal. Something that made the boss fights and a lot of the portions of previous games more enjoyable was their plot significance. You wanted to kill Lazarevich because he was hell-bent on domination and threatened the lives of your friends. Moving through the train wreck in Uncharted 2 was fun because of everything that led to that point, and seeing the betrayal that Drake faced to get there. Before I go any further, I will concede that the Uncharted stories have never been high art or even that good, to be frank. The stories in my eyes were a means of moving you through the different locales, and it served its purpose well. Uncharted's characters, on the other hand, was where the strength lied. I also know that myself and many others don't play Uncharted for its story, and with that being said, we should talk about the plot. And, oh man, it's kind of shitty. The narratives in Uncharted have seen far more criticism and praise than its gameplay, which I've always found confusing. But digressing, I don't think I've seen many people praise Uncharted 3's story on the whole. That's not to say there aren't things to enjoy about it. There are. But it feels as though Drake's deception works surprisingly well on a microscopic level. Analyzing individual moments proves that there are moments of brilliance and fun, but it's when you look at the story as a whole that you notice the bigger picture isn't a pretty one. The plot begins with Nathan Drake and Victor Sullivan, 2 years after Among Thieves, meeting at a bar in London to sell Sir Francis Drake's ring to a man named Talbot. After Talbot attempts to give them forged pounds, a brawl breaks out, with a man named Cutter eventually shooting the two in front of both Talbot and a woman named Marlowe, who takes the ring and makes her escape. As the two are presumed dead, we get a flashback that explains the origins of Nate and Sully's relationship, and their rivalry with Marlowe, who much like them, wants the ring. When we exit the flashback, we see that Cutter, or Charlie, was actually working with Nate and Sully, and the murder was staged to fool Marlowe, and Nate was also wearing a fake ring with the real being in his pocket. Meeting up with Chloe from Uncharted 2, the crew follow Marlowe into the underground, and discover that the artifact in her possession that when paired with Sir Francis Drake's ring can decode clues to the lost city of Ubar, or the Atlantis of the Sands, the team receives their next clue. With a map in possession that shows them the location of two artifacts, the crew splits up to acquire them. After a long run-in with Marlowe and a broken leg from Cutter, Charlie and Chloe decide to back out, feeling it is too dangerous. Sully and Drake move forward on their own and head to Yemen to investigate further thanks to their old friend Elena. At least, Sully's old friend. Before Nate and Elena can argue too much, Drake is drugged by Marlowe and then kidnapped by a pirate named Ramses. He also finds that Marlowe has kidnapped Sully as well. Drake then wakes up on an abandoned shipwreck, moves through the troubled waters, and eventually washes up in Yemen, tracking down Elena and devising a plan to rescue Sully. Intercepting a cargo plane that is meant to deliver supplies to Marlowe's crew who are in the desert closing in on the location of Ubar, Drake ends up tearing it apart and wanders in the desert before barely being saved by a man named Salim, who doesn't want Marlowe to get a hold of the powers within Ubar. And with a common goal, he helps Drake rescue Sully, and now the two reunited head into the city. Drake is unfortunately drugged once again, separated from Sully, and after moving further into the city, they encounter Talbot and Marlowe attempting to pull the cursed treasure from the depths of Ubar, but Drake is able to thwart these plans. As the crew is escaping, Marlowe falls in quicksand, and despite Drake's hesitation, he tries to save Marlowe but fails, leaving Talbot enraged. Nathan is then forced to defeat Talbot before escaping with Sully, and a few coins to spare. As the crew is preparing to head back home, Sully explains that Nathan and Elena should give their relationship another try. Nathan listens to his old mentor's advice, and that's where our game ends. So, you may have noticed that there were a few details I didn't mention in this summary, and that is because there is little reason to even mentioning it. That's not to say they aren't interesting, but rather that the interesting details feel overshadowed by the more uninteresting points that are front and center. For example, let's look at the villains and the secret of Ubar. As we progress through the plot, we learn more of Sir Francis Drake's journey to Ubar for the Queen. We learn that for some reason he abandoned his adventure, and left warnings for anyone wanting to accomplish what he refused to. Figuring out what he discovered and why he felt the need to not pursue it was far more interesting as a side plot than the main threat, which was Marlowe and Talbot. Marlowe wants the treasure because she is part of the same secret civilization that Sir Francis Drake is part of, one that lacks much depth or detail. She also wants to do it because she wants power, and I can assume a further motivation is to stick it to Nathan, who has been a thorn in her side once before, and judging by some of her actions, she clearly enjoys beating him and Sully. Petty motivations aside, she doesn't really pose much of a threat, and the same goes for Talbot. The only way they get the drop on Drake is when using drugs, and they make it very clear that they don't want to kill anyone. Marlowe states at the beginning of the game that she does not want Sully or Drake dead, and this removes all danger from her character. For comparison's sake, Lazarevich was an actual threat, even if a boring one. He was prepared to kill people, and he did when they got in his way. Flynn, while being a less intimidating rival, was charismatic and was the kind of douchebag you enjoyed hating. Talbot does the exact opposite. Talbot does very little and in many cases says nothing, just giving shit-eating grins and condescending head nods. Furthering my general annoyance to the character is a lack of threat, and the fact that the only time the villains get a leg up on the crew is when a hallucinogenic dart flies in from off-screen thanks to Talbot. Talbot as a character, on the whole, is actually awful. On multiple occasions, he is in the perfect place to thwart our plans and again has no established motivation or personality for that matter. He also genuinely has plot armor. This is most noticeable during the Citadel scene where on one occasion he poisons and speaks to Cutter without anyone noticing and then literally disappears. Not in a Batman-like jumping off the roof to a safe place, he literally walks into a dead end and just pieces out.
He's gone. How in the world?
I can't make this shit up. Later on, Cutter gets a shot at Talbot, and we see it connect, but then minutes later, he's perfectly fine, and Charlie even says, "I know I shot him," but it's never explained. Talbot in Yemen is seen teleporting on multiple occasions, and I could go on, but I think you get the point. There are plot inconsistencies, and then there's this, and Talbot is in a league of his own. Talbot is just a lapdog of Marlowe, who doesn't fare much better. Much like her lackey, she has a pretty minimal backstory and never does any of the dirty work. I like that while Lazarevich was on the generic side, he got his hands dirty, making him him a direct threat. Marlowe is an indirect threat, as she can't do much to hurt Nathan, but her Matrix clones of men in suits can. She also isn't very present in the game, as again, Talbot is the one doing most of the work, and as established, he's not doing a very good job. I wish I had more to say about the primary antagonist here, but there's just nothing to chew on, and that goes for a lot of the characters, including Chloe. I liked Chloe's return, but she doesn't do much aside from offering admittedly funny dialogue.
Morning. Not worth the price of admission, folks.
The same goes for Cutter, who might be one of my favorite characters in the entire series because of how genuinely funny he is, and his little quirks like his claustrophobia was a great way of filling in the downtime and developing him. Unfortunately, for as minimal as my thoughts are on these characters, that's not the worst, as Salim is almost purely a plot device, and again has nothing really to analyze. To clarify, I know that the side characters in the other Uncharted games were no showstoppers either, but the difference is that those side characters had redeeming qualities that allowed me to move past any issues. But here, there are no qualities, as it feels like nobody aside from the main three, Nate, Sully, and Elena, get much screen time. I can at least say that those main three get some decent enough development, or at least that would be the case if they didn't completely retread the plot of Uncharted 2. By the time Uncharted 3 rolls around, Nathan and Elena are split up once again, and bicker amongst themselves until eventually working together and realizing that they still care for each other. It worked well in Uncharted 2, but here it loses all of its impact because it's almost beat for beat what happens in that game, with no new twist other than their relationship has now evolved from dating to engaged, perhaps married. I do like the theme of Elena, while critical of Drake's habit of getting into life-threatening treasure hunts, actually loves it just as much as he does, as does Sully. Sullivan this time around is showing his age. Elena and Sully both think he's just getting too old for it. This, again, doesn't really go anywhere, and they actually hint at Sully dying on more than a few occasions, but nothing comes from it. Another thing the game touches on is Nathan's strange obsession with hunting down treasures, asking if it is because he feels as though he has something to prove. I can appreciate this angle, but again, nothing happens, and I feel like a broken record because when a game has no depth, an analysis can't get very far either, unless I analyze every single piece of dialogue, which other YouTube channels have done already. Perhaps the game could have explored Nathan's obsession through the means of wanting to do something exceptional. Maybe Drake knows that his upbringing wasn't the best and that his parents pretty well abandoned him. And maybe during his time as a child he always felt that he wasn't good enough, leading him to developing this obsession with superiority and being like the historical figures he idolized, journeying across the world to find treasure. But I think I'm just looking too far into this. As of where it stands now, it feels like there are a million plot threads within this game and they all don't go very far. Even the finale here felt underwhelming compared to Shambhala. Ubar, while large and architecturally grand, felt it didn't live up to its mystical description. Not only that, but we don't spend much time in this location, with the game wrapping up this portion and the entire story quite soon after your arrival. It just felt like the team hit all their set pieces that they could, then they just ticked the boxes for the ending. Sully saving some coins, Nate and Elena getting together, and the bad guy dying, and then they said, okay, we're done. I wasn't expecting an epilogue, but I would have liked to have seen something else, like what the plans are for the future, but I guess the games have never really done that. Now, that's not to say that the story here doesn't have things and I think others can enjoy. For one, at a conversation-by-conversation level, the writing here is great, and quite humorous at times too. Moments like Cutter explaining why his cell phone isn't working while not making a ton of sense in the grand plot at least gave me a chuckle.
We've been trying to reach you for over 24 hours.
Oh, right, I need to top up my minutes.
You're using a prepaid phone?
Mate, those contracts are a complete rip-off.
I also appreciated some of the more subtle things within cutscenes, like when Mark Wahlberg and Tom Holland share some food, and Nate reaches for Sully's beer, prompting a subtle cackle from him.
You're a crook, right?
Other scenes with Spider-Man and Boogie Nights are just as fun and do offer some entertainment value on their surface, but not much beneath it. Marlo's reaction to Nathan giving her a fake ring prompts her to make the same hand motion Nate made to her many years ago, when he first duped her, and this felt like a subtle way of showing that she remembered their interaction vividly, without showing another flashback. But again, I think when this is arguably the best scene with Marlo, it says a lot. I feel like I, much like everyone else, ripped into this game's story a lot, and while I do think it is justified, I almost feel bad. Uncharted 3 has some great moments in gameplay and some downright funny ones in its story, but it's held back by how lackluster the story is. The plot at a microscopic level works, scene by scene, but the greater narrative feels disjointed, and as harsh as it is to say, almost unfinished. While that does not hold back the gameplay, it certainly does prevent the product as a whole from being something truly spectacular. Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception as an overall product was actually quite good for me. The gameplay is easily the best the series has seen, and while it doesn't top the train sequence from Uncharted 2, there's a great consistency of high-octane action that swiftly moves you from one explosive segment to the next, with greater diversity in the environments and even quieter moments feel more refined and replayable. Yes, the story was not up to snuff, but I don't think that is reason alone to completely write off Uncharted 3. I see so many people claiming that Uncharted 3 is horrible because of how weak its story is, and I agree, the story here is the worst we've seen. But perhaps I'm in the minority of people who play these games for the gameplay. Especially once we hit the third entry, I stopped expecting a quote-unquote good plot from an Uncharted game. That's not to say you can't criticize it or want a better plot, but I just think that gameplay matters a lot more here. And I feel like there are times where I'm the only one who thinks this. I can at least appreciate the individual moments here that served as a lot of fun, and something to distract me from the likes of Marlowe and Talbot. Uncharted 3 feels like the realization of a movie mutated into the interactive medium. So while I can confidently say that Uncharted 2 is a better overall package, I think this is a solid entry. I like revisiting the Uncharted games, but there's a good chance that when I revisit this one, I'll just skip the cutscenes and focus on the gameplay, where the game's arguably at the trilogy's peak. While its quality has been the center of many discussions, few can deny the success of the Uncharted franchise. Uncharted 4 is a strange game because despite improving on many aspects of the series, it is seen as arguably the most divisive. A glimmer of this divide was seen with the release of Uncharted 3, but it was less of a debate over whether it was good or bad, and more over if it was better or worse than 2. With 4, more began saying that it ruined the franchise or that it was just terrible. Me? I played it a few months after release and I thought it was great. A mature swan song to finish the series, or at least Nate's story. I grew up playing the Uncharted games, and 4 felt like it really grew up with me, offering a more mature story for a now more mature player. The first Uncharted game had a great concept and was a competent title, with a handful of kinks to iron out. Naughty Dog understood the assignment though and delivered Uncharted 2, which is to this day regarded by many as the peak of the series. Uncharted 3 delivered a higher budget but stumbled in storytelling, leading many to be disappointed. After that, there was nothing for a while. To hold us over, we had a few new Tomb Raider games, which I've covered on my channel, but many believe that Drake's Deception would be Nate's last adventure. And fortunately, we were wrong. Uncharted 4 had been in development since the release of 3, but there were concerns regarding direction, especially after Amy Hennig left. Due to the success of The Last of Us, Neil Druckmann took up the role of director. I believe this was why Uncharted took a more mature approach, and the parallels between this and The Last of Us are pretty clear from the moment you boot the game. But this change in tone was not at the expense of the Uncharted identity. A Thief's End feels like a proper step forward without abandoning its roots, and the new features here, some more indicative of the time than others, are welcome additions for both myself and critics across the board, with 9 out of 10 after 9 out of 10 being thrown towards the game. In recent years, it seems the discussion around Uncharted 4 has been one focused on its story more than anything else. This is likely due to Uncharted 4 actually having a story, unlike the last few entries, and as a result of the Uncharted gameplay formula being relatively unchanged since its first entry. That said, I'll be taking a similar approach, focusing on the story and the characters throughout, but don't worry, the gameplay will get all of the love it deserves. I'll also clarify now that there will be many things that I won't talk about in the usual detail, such as the gunplay, because I've already talked about it in regards to the previous entries, and I don't want to retread my steps. This will apply to criticisms too, unless I have more to say, and if other YouTube videos are an indicator, I will probably have a lot to say. It also seemed as though the biggest issue people had with this game was in regards to some of its characters, which seem to be missing the mark more often than not. Because on the whole, Uncharted 4 is a game that somehow continues to innovate the series, albeit suffering from the diminishing returns, and delivers a story that while having more issues than the previous entries, has more positives, delivering some series high points. Though a mature story is appreciated, Uncharted can at times take itself too seriously, leading to a more sophisticated experience at the sacrifice of plain old fun. That in and of itself is important to note. The audience for this game. I've said before that I found the Uncharted games are best when expecting fun. I never desired Uncharted to have a more serious tone, and I appreciated that while the set pieces and excuses for gameplay were at times ridiculous, it was done in the name of fun. This isn't to say that I can't appreciate a deep and serious plot, but I appreciate Uncharted as a series that filled the dumb action game genre that I'd play when I wanted some low-stakes, enjoyable distractions. So, as someone who appreciated the emphasis on the over-the-top, goofy, dumb action, how does this game hold up? Well. Remarkably well. Something that Uncharted had a great balance between was the hyper-realism of its art style and its Jak and Daxter reminiscent animations. This was clear in the first game, but as the series went on, the animations and series as a whole became driven by pure realism. Uncharted had all the traits of an action movie, but its visuals were always lacking. That's not a criticism. When the first few games were released, it was astounding that the graphics looked so good, but it was still clear that it was a video game. With the power of the PS4, it was now possible to truly blur the lines between the game and reality. Sure, the uncanny valley is one visible from many angles, but when a character has visible pores, that valley is obscured. There are so many wallpaper-worthy moments here, and they all move at a locked 60 frames per second on the PlayStation 5. Not only that, but the game looks even crisper, and we now have the whole Uncharted series, barring Golden Abyss, in 60 frames per second, which is great. I'll admit, there were a few more glitches than I remember on this remaster, but overall the game ran fantastic. The cutscenes in Uncharted games have always been exceptional, but here, the facial expressions especially are on the next level, and still rival the likes of today's releases. There are few games that properly capture the look on someone's face when you can see the gears turning. When Sam comes up with the lights out plan, you can physically see the small details on his face as he works through the thought. These are nuances that are typically not captured in games, and it's one of the reasons that this game leaves the uncanny valley for me. The cinematography is also genuinely astounding, and I appreciate that the linearity of Uncharted's gameplay is used to a greater extent narratively. What's most shocking is that the music is used in a similar fashion. When Nate starts playing with his Nerf guns in the attic, the combat music starts playing, and the OST here is actually my favorite in the series. It has the relaxing acoustics to accompany a seemingly normal life, and the usual orchestrals for adventuring, but I want to call your attention to one sound. This whistle thing, I don't really know anything about music, is representative of Nathan's lust for adventure. Whenever his interest is piqued or when the call for adventure strikes, we always hear the same whistle. We first hear this whistle when Nate looks at the tropical painting on the wall, and the whistle drowns out every other sound as he is whisked away into another daydream. When Sam tells Nate about the other cross, right as his eyes light up like a Christmas tree, realizing the potential in front of him, that whistle is there again. It always accompanies the allure of adventure. It's a detail that goes unnoticed by many, and yet it has such a large impact. Environments this time around look spectacular and lived in, which is especially clear inside the residential areas. Nate's home is a chaotic mausoleum, with the attic acting as a graveyard to an old life. One that Nate can't help but spend time in, reminiscing. But this Nathan Drake has changed. He's left his dude-rating life behind, and his neglect to the cleanliness of his home is a reflection of his own uncertain place in life. He's left the treasure hunting behind, but it's a constant decision and one he must make every day. This is something many people will need to confront at one point in their lives, one way or another. The idea that you need to abandon a passion or even an addiction for your own self-benefit. We'll talk about this more, but the reason I draw attention to the cluttered nature of Nate and Elena's home is because it reflects his life. And even later on when his home is decorated with the same dirty laundry, I believe it's for a different reason. The outside environments are where the game truly shines. So much so that I'd like to admit a fault in a completely different review. In my Tomb Raider 2013 video, I explained that the game looked bland, but I excused it because how good can mud and trees really look when a color palette is just green and brown? Uncharted 4 is a perfect example of how to make these muddy and gross environments look vibrant and luscious, even during stormier weather. I won't indulge in too many other comparisons, but the point here is to say that the fauna feels beautiful, but never overshadows the other works of beauty on display. Architecture is perfection, outfits are stylish, and it's just Uncharted. The series has looked exceptional thus far, and this game takes it to the next level. The gameplay has seen marginal improvements too, but its replayability is sacrificed for maturity. As is the case with the presentation, the gameplay is largely unchanged, at least in the movement and gunplay department. The major difference here is the activities you actually perform. The Uncharted games previously focused on movement and gunplay with a pinch of stealth for garnish, but nothing in between save for a few QuickTime events. This was fine because all these aspects were carried by the absurd set pieces. Yeah, I know, running and tapping X is by no means mechanically engaging, but when doing that in a flooding ship, I'd say there's enough to keep me entertained. But Nate's getting a little too old for these things, don't you think? And as such, Uncharted 4 needs to step up its game. Or does it? Yes, there are some new mechanics here like the sword fighting, the driving, and the diving, but there's also an appropriate amount of the mundane. I realize I'm about to praise boredom, but as established, the narrative plays a greater role in the gameplay and vice versa. When the game begins, we get introduced to something new and fun immediately. Driving the boat in the heat of a gunfight, paralleling the beginning of the trilogy, quotes about jamming a man of fortune and all. But right as we are about to reach the climax of the action, we're pulled out of it and brought to the ironic orphanage, where we do some slick scaling of towers before flashing forward to the Panamanian jail. It's here that we get some combat, puzzles, and traversal, but never more than one at a time. I've stated previously that Uncharted is at its best when its gameplay facets intersect, and Naughty Dog knows this. I believe that's why the first few chapters that act as tutorials are meant to not be boring, but to leave us wanting more. By the end of our time in the prison, we get an epic escape, and what happens at the height of this action is we are pulled away again. This time, drowning in the slow tranquility of the ocean, the calmest waters we'll see in the game. I don't know about you, but all I could think was, what the hell? We just got into the action here. What are we doing? We went from adventures and fistfights to scrounging for cargo? We went from a Nathan in the early stages of his obsession, one that had ambition in his eyes and a witty remark for every possibility, to one that flat out declines the opportunity to go looking for treasure.
Hey, maybe you should hang out then. See if you can find some other treasures down there.
Nah, I'm good.
We then ride up with the cargo and spend time talking to our crewmates? This isn't what we signed up for. And by the time we do get what we signed up for, there's still something missing. We get an action-packed escape, but as Sam. We want the adventure just as much as Nate does, and we don't actually get that until Chapter 6, roughly an hour and a half into the game, and man, is it satisfying. This is an expert way of teasing the player, explaining the mechanics, having enough narrative here to make repeat playthroughs engaging, and making them want to play the game more, which I certainly did. The actual gunplay this time around is much tighter, and feels as accurate as it could be with the bullet spread. And I've rethought my criticisms regarding the bullet spread too. In previous entries I criticized the lack of precision, but I wonder if this was done to make players spray and pray more. Nate isn't some John Wick, and is always portrayed as a very lucky average Joe. And perhaps I want to lean into the inexperienced running and gunning like he would. I still don't like the spread, but a different perspective couldn't hurt. I like the gun selection this time around with a decent variety, but a lack of suppressed pistols really hurt replayability. In Uncharted 3, you could at least give yourself a silenced pistol on repeat playthroughs to engage in some stealth. And despite this game having the best stealth system in the series, a silencer on anything is absent. We'll see more examples of a lack of replayability, but sticking to our guns, let's talk about enemies. They are the generic run-of-the-mill soldiers, and that's it. Uncharted 4 marks the second time that a supernatural force has not been included, and this means that the enemy variety takes a hit, but I can accept this change. Considering that the game wanted a grounded story, a limited selection is sound, and while in a vacuum this is technically worse than previous entries, when looking at the bigger picture, it works. I further appreciate that Naughty Dog didn't opt for the all too common enemy archetypes, such as the suicide bombers like those seen in the Infamous games, because those kinds of enemies would have me bald by 23. Keeping in mind the bigger picture is important when discussing the Uncharted series, and why I've often disliked the idea of only discussing one facet of the game, because Uncharted has always been greater than the sum of its parts. I know I am looking at many aspects in a vacuum, but that comes with the territory of an in-depth video. But I bring this up to explain that the lack of enemy variety was not a problem for me because the enemy AI, the set pieces, and the tools at my disposal more than made up for it. Enemies will rush you, but not with harming themselves in mind. If you shoot one, chances are they'll run to cover, but their updated AI is showcased best in the revamped stealth. The stealth in previous games was always an option, but it was clear that it was unintended. Perhaps it's because of Nate's age, but he sticks to the bushes far more this time around. Moves slowly in bushes to not be spotted. Enemies have detection times that are forgiving, but by no means easy, and while this is minimalistic compared to the contemporaries, it also works. Uncharted, whether through a desire to keep things simple or an iron will, did not add a thief vision for you to use during stealth, not allowing our average Joe to spot enemies through walls. There is a thief vision in the bonus options, but this in and of itself feels like a joke at the expense of every other stealth series, with enemies and allies being highlighted in blue and red, and the rest of the world being entirely devoid of color. Not even a tint for good measure. Your allies can help you, often pointing out enemies that are hard to spot, highlighting them temporarily, but that's it. The best part of this thief vision joke that the game is seemingly playing is that the enemy layouts are challenging and fair enough that I never felt that something like this was actually required. My only complaint is that stealth is near required to be done in close proximity. A silencer, again, would help add variety and could be used for distractions, but in its current form, you're forced to either melee for a ghost run or cause anonymous chaos with grenades and dynamite. Aerial takedowns are an addition to the stationary and ledge takedowns and are way too fun to perform, especially when paired with the rope, as you can dive from a high point and then swing on top of somebody. The rope swing is indicative of the game's release, as every game from 2015 and 16 had a grappling hook of sorts, but this is one of the better iterations. Of course, with Uncharted's movement, verticality plays a solid role here for both you and your enemy, and this acts as one of stealth's biggest strengths. Many layouts have snipers on high vantage points, barring anyone below from being taken out, so now the goal is to make it to the vantage point without being seen and taking out the sniper before getting to everyone else. But the best part is, you don't even need to do that. You could just walk past everyone, skipping the encounter. It's a small option, but it goes a long way and feels realistic. The embodiment of being too old for this shit is just saying, I won't deal with it unless I have to. Outside of combat, the climbing has seen one very slight change that scratches a strange itch in my monkey brain. Nate reaches for ledges. You can still get around by Spider-Manning up walls, but now, simply pointing the stick where you want to go will prompt a slower animation of Nate clambering to the next handheld. This is less efficient than the Olympic vertical leaps, but it plays into this idea of Nate getting older and more sluggish. I ended up going through most of the game climbing like this. There's more variety in the animations, and it immersed me more than any previous game's climbing did. Movement additions are restricted to slopes and ropes, often being placed one after another, but it never reaches any proper platforming climax. Perhaps it doesn't need to, as while a challenging platforming system could have been more fun, the climbing this time around, due to its grounded nature, can feel oddly tranquil at times, in stark contrast. One of the most stunning chapters in the game is near the end. Chapter 21 sees you chasing after Samuel Drake throughout the unnamed island of Libertalia, but there's minimal music, minimal dialogue, and no combat. There's a solid 5-minute stretch where no ledges give way, no bridges break beneath your weight. Couple this with the luscious fauna and we have a match made in a blissful peace, scaling a cliff that overlooks a sight of nature many couldn't dream of. And what does Nate have to say about this? Absolutely nothing. This beauty of nature was touched on in Uncharted 3, notably in the desert, but finally this vision is fully realized and its impact exponential as it sits next to the action. Peace and chaos are relative tones, and the lull of one cannot be properly appreciated without the high octane of the other. Floating through these albeit short transitionary spaces between set pieces, skimming on the surface of the story, makes the eventual return to the deeper plot and action one that is well paced. A Thief's End never hits the brakes, it simply eases up on the gas. A moment rarely overstays its welcome. While many adore the flight through the desert in Uncharted 3, Nathan goes through a near comical amount of close calls throughout the game, extending the set pieces for arguably longer than necessary. Uncharted 4 has a set piece, like a building collapsing, and in line with its realistic tone, it ends. Once the building turns to rubble and rubble to dust, it's given time to settle. This allows these set pieces to be more memorable, and not exhausting despite this game's relatively long runtime. And that's not to say there isn't much action overall. There's an entire chapter and a half dedicated to escaping the Panamanian jail we've heard so much about, and Scotland has a chain of stealth and combat back to back. And I like it because by the time you get to the auction, it'll be the first time you're required to use your skills in tandem with each other. The traversal and shooting spheres begin overlapping, and there's bound to be blunders along the way. By the time you get to Scotland though, you've gained or regained your bearings, now capable of handling the gauntlet of scenarios coming your way. The difficulty curve is smooth, and the usual suspects are responsible. Enemies with bigger guns and eventually bigger explosives fill out the ever-increasing number of guards at each encounter. I would say that my only complaint is that some of these endgame scenarios truly feel as though you're taking down a small army, with the number of overlapping sightlines reaching above 15. Fortunately, if you're like me and tend to reset anytime you're spotted, you'll appreciate that the checkpoints were merciful, and repeat playthroughs are accounted for. This is my favorite new feature, and it's that you can replay specific scenarios within a chapter. Every major encounter can be played over and over, a small quality of life feature, but one I haven't seen replicated since. It cuts down on all the fluff between set pieces, which is normally filled with dialogue that after the third playthrough begins to go in one ear and out the other. Speaking of which, those set pieces continue with the grounded themes, and while don't top the sheer absurdity of the train segment, and thusly don't stick out in memory as much, they never fail to entertain. Climbing the clock tower, moving through the falling watchtower, driving through the city in the 4x4, and of course the final fight against Wraith. This is one of the few boss fights in the game, and I've seen it criticized for being mechanically bare. And that is a valid criticism, but you guys know what series we're in, right? I've stopped expecting mechanical depth from Uncharted, but either way, it sees you fighting with square and dodging with the right and left face buttons corresponding with the direction of the attack. Wraith will switch sides mid-combo, but it wasn't challenging. But the novelty was enough to carry almost the whole fight. By the end, I'll admit it does begin to overstay its welcome, but it ends quickly after. While a melee fight may seem inappropriate, I like the idea presented here of the thieves of present times paralleling the thieves of old. Though there are some narrative issues with this, but for now let's focus on the fight, which is my favorite of the series. I mentioned that I wasn't a fan of the first two games' final battles, and Uncharted 3 was a marginal improvement, even if it was a glorified QuickTime event. Here it's a similar sentiment, but with the added narrative depth it holds more weight. That and Talbot sucked. The other marginal fight here is against Nadine, twice. These fights function similarly to the Talbot fights from Drake's Deception, and so my thoughts are the same. Adding dialogue was nice enough, but both these fights are essentially set pieces. Typically, a set piece will see you only engaging in one facet. When the inevitable car chase shows up this time around, the rope is added for spice, but it's ultimately the same shooting from a vehicle, jumping to another, rinse and repeat. Others see you quickly scaling a structure that is collapsing, and I appreciate that the mechanics here are so shallow in these moments because it allows your hands to go on autopilot whilst your eyes glaze over with the awe of sensory overload. The boss fights achieve the same thing. Yes, complex mechanics can add to a set piece. It's far easier to feel like a badass if, as the player, you are required to pull off difficult gameplay feats. But Uncharted's priorities have been cinematic experience first, gameplay second. And by that metric, I think these fights succeed. Alright, enough praise. It's time to talk about something I absolutely despise about this game, and that is collectibles. The treasures are acceptable. They are easy to spot and reward you for poking around. Well, that's actually the issue, the rewards. The guns available here are slim, lacking a silenced pistol or tranquilizer darts, or anything outside of loud guns and explosives. As far as modifiers and filters, it's pretty good. Slow motion, bullet time, flip world, low gravity, it's all fun and adds variety to the consecutive playthroughs. However, the lack of skin swaps is severely disappointing. In previous entries, you could swap Nate's model with any other character, such as Elena or Sully in their different outfits. But the most egregious absence is of Donut Drake. I can't project myself onto Mr. Sixpack in his 40s, okay? I need someone with a little meat on their bones. Seriously, the lack of options on this front severely hinders the replayability and fun factor. It was always enjoyable seeing the massive Donut Drake soar through the sky on his way to slam some enemies, and it would have been even better in this game. It appears that Naughty Dog did this with hopes of keeping integrity within the story and to not offend anyone. To quote Druckmann, "I didn't want to have a laugh at someone's expense. I thought we matured beyond that." And I can totally get behind this idea, even if as an overweight person I still found it humorous. But I think restricting the characters you play as just takes away the fun for seemingly no reason. And this extends past Donut Drake. Let me play as Rafe, Sam, Sully, Nadine. Instead, we can just choose their outfits for their appearance in a chapter, which isn't that much fun. I know it's a nitpick, but genuinely, these options from previous games were some of my favorite parts, and I'm disappointed not seeing it here. Back to the good. I mentioned the different gameplay facets that fill in the time between set pieces like driving the car, swimming, driving a boat, but we haven't talked about the puzzles. The puzzles this time around are by far the best in the series, hands down. Previous games had an issue with the journal, which rather than offer hints for the player, just gave them the answer. On top of this, the answers were often so easy that one could stumble upon them accidentally. Uncharted 3 saw some steps in the right direction as it offered puzzles based on logic rather than following instructions, and here the notebook offers hints, but the actual solving of the puzzle is left up to the player as it should be. The worst of the puzzles is within the clock tower, as it's near identical to the instruction manual puzzles of Uncharted 1, but the large difference is that the set piece and novelty of climbing the gears is entertaining enough to carry what many would not even consider a puzzle. The best of the puzzles here is actually a tie. It's my video, I'm cheating. The first is when you have to configure the sigils on Avery's secret tomb underneath the previous clock tower puzzle. You have to look at the icons, find out who they belong to, and then turn them in a way that their sides connect. It's simple, but there's enough complexity later on where some of the symbols and their owners are obscured, leading the player to fill in the gaps. The game allows you to turn the icons within your journal before actually trying to, which offers a quality of life, and it allowed the journal to be a tool, but not the solution. This is only rivaled by the puzzle which sees you jotting down some symbols and eventually using it to get through one of Avery's traps. There are symbols with squares surrounding them, and each symbol has a series of safe squares to walk on, with the others leading to death. It's one of the more simple puzzles, but emphasizes something I appreciate about the gameplay broadly, but specifically the puzzles, which is that they never overstay their welcome. The Roman numeral puzzle within Drake's Fortune was fine enough, but it lasted for too long. The puzzles and mechanics here are, for the most part, used once or twice before being dropped. It lets moments hang in memory for longer. On the whole, while the gameplay has not seen the biggest improvements, it has greater diversity that allows the long run time to not feel overwhelming. A virtue of a shorter Uncharted is that there's a denser plot with more action, but this leads to burnout and an exhaustion from the over-the-top. But here, there is more to the transitionary segments than dialogue or puzzles, which are significantly better here too. But the biggest improvement to the Uncharted series this game graces us with is in the plot department. The Uncharted series has never had good plots, and I don't think that's a hot take. Sure, they were never terrible, but there wasn't much to it at all. The games often presented ideas and nothing more. This time around we have a story with more meat on the bones, so to speak, and it lends itself to a game that while still succeeding or suffering from its tropes and cliches, has well-developed ideas and themes that make for the best story in the series. The game begins in the heat of the action with Nate and Sam before the two are seemingly shipwrecked. We are then shown Nate in his Catholic orphanage where he sneaks out with his brother to go exploring. We cut back to Nate and Sam in a Panamanian jail working with Rafe Adler, a rich boy funding the Drake's hunt for Henry Avery's treasure. Their man on the inside is the prison warden, who after attempting to get a cut of the treasure is killed by Rafe. This causes a riot and the boys end up leaving the prison, but not before Sam is killed in the chaos. Fast forward again and we get a taste of a retired Drake who scrounges for underwater cargo and spends his evenings doing paperwork in a messy home. Thankfully, he shares that home with his now wife, Elena Fisher. Things are normal until Drake gets an offer for an illegal job out in Malaysia, but determined to keep out of trouble, says no. Yet another wrench is thrown in his plans though, manifested through his brother Sam, who thanks to the help of Hector Alcazar, the local drug lord, is alive and out of prison, but in order to pay his debt to Alcazar, he must find Henry Avery's treasure, and needs Nate's help. Nate can't really say no, so the two pair up with Sully and head to an auction to find the other cross needed to find the treasure. They run into Rafe again and his friend Nadine, who owns Shoreline. Nate runs into Nadine one-on-one and the auction is basically turned into a war zone, but the crew is able to leave and find that their next clue is in Scotland. Scotland goes as well as you can imagine, and eventually their hijinks continue to Madagascar, where after a ton of action and treasure hunting, Elena shows up. having figured out Nate's lie. Despite her anger, the crew has moved on and head to an island, which is where we started the game. After tracking down the treasure to the lost city of Libertalia, we learn that 12 legendary pirates, including Avery and Thomas too, decided to pool their loot together. But this leads to betrayal from within, leaving just Avery and two alive. While this mystery unravels, Nate and Sam run into Rafe and Nadine, with Rafe revealing that the Alcazar story was a lie, and that Rafe was the one to break Sam out of prison. Right as tensions are high, Nate is sent off a cliff, and as he hits the ground, we get another flashback where Nate and Sam break into the home of their past mother's associate, only for said associate to die in front of them. After ditching the cops, the two decide to abandon their legal last names, Morgan for Drake. Upon waking, Elena has tracked Nate down thanks to Sully, and the two make their way back to Sam. While doing so, the two end up discovering that Avery went mad, attempting to take the spoils off of the island, and booby-trapping every part of the island he could. When catching up to Sam and meeting up with Sully, the gang decides after some pushback from Sam to stop searching for the treasure and for once quit while they're ahead. That is, until Sam decides at the last minute to change his mind, prompting Drake to head after him. He spots Rafe and Nadine arguing about the lack of spoils thus far, and the heavy cost for something that isn't even guaranteed. Once it is revealed that Nadine's men have turned on her in favor of Rafe's money, Drake follows Rafe, who is on his way to investigate the boat. On the boat, Nate finds Sam pinned under some wood with an angry Rafe reveling in finding the treasure. Nadine then shows up and traps the two in the room. Rafe attempts to kill Nate but fails, and then Nate escapes the sinking ship with Sam and no loot. On the way back home, the gang parts ways and we flash forward to Nate and Elena, as she reveals that Sam snuck coins into his pocket on the way out, making everyone, including them, filthy rich. With this money, the two purchase the company Nate works for, and leads a long life of legal treasure hunting, broadcasting their efforts on Elena's now revived TV show. We then flash forward again for an epilogue where we play as Cassie Drake, discovering for the first time her parents passed as pirates. It's there that the game ends on a happily ever after. The story here had a lot of depth and more interesting B-plots than previous entries, with enough foreshadowing and connections to make even a second playthrough worthy of not skipping the cutscenes. Also, I find that a lot of reviews of the plot I see online are muddled with nitpicks. While it's fine to pick apart every aspect of the story, I don't often find it enjoyable, and that's not to disregard the actual problems here, but to say that I won't be going for the usual low-hanging fruit. Yes, it is strange that Sam is able to sneak home a bunch of coins in his cargo pants without making any jingling sounds with every movement, and yes, Sam says that the bike is a gift that can't wait until Christmas despite the calendar saying it's January, but these are inconsequential to the overall story, so they don't bother me. What I like is a lot of the connections and foreshadowing that's made here. Nate will have a conversation about wanting a dog, and this is paid off in the epilogue as he has a dog. His home is full of inanimate foreshadowing and callbacks. You can find his and Elena's wedding photos, but eventually, when you play as Cassie, there are photos of her. There are 2 points in which you visit Nate's home, once as Nate in Chapter 4 and once in the epilogue as Cassie. Both times, Nate's home is an absolute mess. Laundry clutters the floor and the materials of shelves is completely obscured by knickknacks and trinkets from past adventures. If the gameplay up to this point didn't reinforce the idea that you are past your prime, then reflecting on the previous adventures certainly will. I believe that Nate's home looks like a bomb went off in it because he's unhappy. He's discontent with his life right now, so finding the motivation to do the more menial tasks like laundry gets pushed to the wayside. It could also be because Nate spent so long on the streets with his brother and on adventures that he never learned how to properly care for a home. What is more interesting is that when the game ends, his new home is still a mess. I think the reason it is still messy this time is due to him and Elena being capable of indulging in their passions so much that they find themselves getting distracted. Because while both of them are responsible adults, they both are victim to the obsessions of their passions. One of the major themes of Uncharted 4 is obsession, which, while the same as Uncharted 3, is actually explored here in both subtle and overt ways, so it feels brand new. Nate loves treasure hunting, nobody's questioning that, but Nate will often do this to his own detriment, allowing his obsessions and competitive nature to get him in some unwise predicaments. He always begins by hunting for personal interest, but once the antagonist is introduced, his motivation shifts to accommodate the competition. Nate wanted to find Shambhala, but he also desperately wants to get one over on Flynn, and eventually wants to prevent the sap of Shambhala from getting into the wrong hands. In Uncharted 3, when against Marlowe, it was presented as an obsession with finding the treasure, but I now believe that this was an obsession with winning. Nate, throughout his whole life, has been patronized and told he's not capable of doing something, and even when those people are right, he feels the need to prove them wrong. Here, this is done the same, but in tandem with the obsession with adventure. I mentioned it already, but the conversation with Elena in the kitchen is a perfect example of this. He is so enamored by even the thought of treasure hunting that he can't help but space out, daydreaming about it. While it is admirable seeing someone who has discovered and loves their passion, it's also sad. Nate has a partner, a home, a stable income, and yet he still isn't satisfied. Even in his current comfortable life, he'd rather be facing the barrel of a gun if it meant adventure. I say it's sad, but I also feel that it's beautiful and relatable. Not in the sense that I enjoy death-defying adventures, but that there are so many who have discovered their passions in life and would sacrifice everything to do it. Some haven't discovered that thing yet, but those who have, you know exactly how Nate feels. I know I do. My ultimate passion is making videos. It's my ultimate outlet, the perfect canvas for my thoughts to splatter, and it's something I enjoy so much that everything else in my life has become boring in comparison. That doesn't mean that, like Nate, there aren't struggles. There are. There are always going to be challenges, but you're happy doing what you do despite all that. I've had moments before where I will mentally check out of a conversation because I just thought of the coolest thumbnail, or I've had a revelation about whatever game I'm writing about. It sounds sad on the surface, but nothing else in my life brings me more satisfaction and pure bliss than expressing myself through this medium. And it's been that way since I first started making videos at age 11. And now I, like Nate, have found a way to sustain myself through my passion. And it's why, as annoying as it may seem, I thank you for your support so much. My gratitude is as endless as my passion, and Uncharted provides a great commentary on the challenges that come with pursuing your passions. Nate, at the beginning of the game, is willing to sacrifice everything for just one last ride. He almost without hesitation lies to Elena, his wife, to help his brother, and he nearly loses her over it. He keeps pretending to justify it as saving Sam, but everyone knows that's not his real reason for going. By the time his journey comes to a close, he is ready to leave it behind, and even when he does go to rescue Sam, he does not bother grabbing coins on the way out. He's there for his new treasure, his family. A major part of Nate's journey is indulging in his passions but not letting it consume him, and his realization of this is why he ultimately survives. Personally, this is where the relatability ends, as while I've sacrificed some time with friends or hours of my sleep for my passions, I'm not at a point where I'd risk my safety for it. That doesn't mean it isn't an interesting concept to explore, as taking the sentiment to its extreme is clearly interesting, and that's not to say that people don't go to that extent, but that I just have little experience in it, and thusly little reflection. Sam struggles with a similar obsession, but he has an added layer of greed. Sam's time in prison has clearly not treated him well, and it makes sense that someone who shits in the same room as he sleeps would want everything and nothing less by the time he gets out, but his greed is what flashes his life before his eyes. While this is a flawed mindset, I can understand the rationale, and it makes Sam more human. He too is willing to risk his relationships with his family, lying to Nate's face. I believe that's why he's so opposed to Sully too, and anyone other than Nate, because he can't manipulate them like he can with Nathan, and God forbid one of them knows Alcazar. You can even see this in cutscenes, as when he's pitching something, he focuses on convincing Nate rather than the others because he knows he calls the shots. Sam shows a clear mental tug of war between greed and his own safety, and it's a smart way of showing the player where this obsession and greed gets them. We see the parallels between Sam and Rafe and Henry and 2, greedy men who both died at the hands of their own distrust. We can't show Nate succumbing to greed because he's a main character, and not many stories can end with the character's death. But showing Avery and 2 suffering the consequences, and then Sam with one foot in the grave, is all the reinforcement we need. Something that made Rafe more interesting was how he was the opposite to Sam. Sam had nothing, and spent most of his life in prison. Meanwhile, Rafe inherited his father's riches and had everything handed to him. He has never had to work for anything. He started at the top, and his greed is not for the monetary riches, but for the legacy of being the one to find the treasure. There's a deep-rooted insecurity in his attitude towards the Drakes. The reality is, Rafe has thrown all of his money to this treasure, but hasn't done enough of the work, and doesn't have the passion to properly succeed. He feels a frustration in the idea that he, despite his resources, is being beaten by 2 average Joes who had nothing but a little bit of luck. The issue is that this is barely shown throughout the game. Rafe is one of the best developed villains, sure, but it's only due to one line that reveals a glance at his inner monologue.
Don't hand it to me. I had everything handed to me on a goddamn silver platter. I earned this.
Otherwise, Adler falls victim to being yet another underdeveloped Uncharted villain. But there is no rich Uncharted villain without their partner. We had Eddie and Navarro, Flynn, Talbot, and now we have... I guess we gotta talk about Nadine. The largest criticism I see levied against Nadine is done within her first appearance. When Nadine shows up, she takes down Nate and eventually holds off both Sam and Nate. A few people have taken issue with this because not only is Nadine outnumbered, but she's marginally smaller than Drake. That said, I don't see the issue here. I get it, bigger guys should be able to win, but Nadine is clearly trained in fighting, whereas Nate and Sam are not. Some have argued that Nate has fighting experience taking down guys far larger than her, which I'll admit is true. I mean, look at Uncharted 3's opening. But what about when a no-name goon in Uncharted 3 just manhandles Nate in the cargo plane? In this game, even in the prison, Nate is overpowered by thugs on multiple occasions, so why does it matter when someone who is actually qualified to kick his ass does? Nadine is again not some pool hall goon, but a trained professional. Look at her technique, that isn't stuff you learn on the streets. There's also the fact that Nate has been retired for a while, and is pushing 40, being approximately 38, and Sam is 45. Nadine is getting up there too at 35, but that is still a large difference between her and Sam, and a large enough difference between her and Nathan. This is also, within cutscenes often considered canon, one of the first fights Nate's been in over 3 years. Meanwhile, Nadine has been on active duty and assumedly training this whole time. It's also not as though Nadine just pummels him. He gets some decent shots in, and while it's clear that Nate is outclassed, he still holds his own. A rather disingenuous point I often see is that she is able to take on both Sam and Drake at the same time. This is true, she can take them on, but she can't win. And not only does the game literally make her lose, but she even acknowledges that she can't win and is merely buying time. It's easy to call Nadine's skill unrealistic, but directly after this, Nate catches a gun from Sam while hanging off a light post. And I'll stop myself now because it's clear Nate can pull off feats of incredible coordination and strength. But when a different character matches that, suddenly it's a problem. Honestly, this sounds like the internet's hypersensitivity to politics. A few people get annoyed over it, and then everyone else is now playing through the game looking for political messaging where there isn't. I've said it before that you can find politics in every corner of a game if you look hard enough. But if you are misinterpreting a trained specialist outmaneuvering a past his prime adventurer with no formal training as Naughty Dog wanting to shove female empowerment in your face, then I don't know what to tell you. I could tell you that Naughty Dog will often have a character overpower Drake for the sake of building tension and reminding you that Nate is just an average Joe. Look at Charlie, who's able to absolutely manhandle Nate in Drake's deception as a means of positioning him as a threat. The same is done with Talbot, who is also marginally smaller than Nate. If the motivation with Nadine was female empowerment, I doubt they would have her story end in her getting smacked by a man, having her mercenaries turn on her, and then having her leave the island no richer. She suffers some of the greatest long-term losses outside of Rafe. And also, beware playing the older games, as Chloe and Elena are both very capable women that in many ways break traditional roles. Apologies for the side tangent, but this argument with Nadine has always confused me, and admittedly my thoughts will likely fall on deaf ears, responding with the same counter-arguments of woke propaganda among other words that have lost all their meaning. Despite claiming to hate politics in their games, gamers can't seem to stop talking about it. Maybe that's because the problem isn't politics in games at all, it's just politics that the individual disagrees with. But we should discontinue the paradoxical means in which we discuss these things. Getting so up in arms about political messaging, especially ones like this that are vague enough as it is, ironically moves more discussion and thought towards politics. Being so hypervigilant towards political messaging means that you will ultimately find more of it. But perhaps it's not about politics at all, and the hatred towards Nadine in this scene is a manifestation of masculine insecurities, which would explain why the overt political themes mentioned in the collectibles are largely ignored, and even the overt political themes in other games are not met with the same opposition. Now, despite the hypocrisy I'm about to commit, I'm not going to comment on my feelings of the politics present here, because I lack the proper education to articulate my thoughts, and it would be unwise to use my platform to promote worldviews that may not be correct or educated, as opposed to just talking about a game I like. I just feel the need to bring this up because throughout many of the reviews of this game that I watched, I noticed this issue was a running theme, and it was worth mentioning. Anyways, let's get back to my specialty, dumb video games. And to help me, I've brought on Giant Pokey Spyro, who has his own thoughts on Nadine's fight.
Now, I'd be lying if I said the lack of an ability to actually participate in these fights didn't drive me up the walls in my first playthrough. I remember mashing circle only to realize that my dodge button was on vacation. But each time I come back to this game, I find myself appreciating them more and more in a narrative sense. And come on, you're not a real Uncharted fan if you don't love seeing Drake get thrown out the window non-stop. The Uncharted series is notorious for having this extreme disparity between gameplay and cutscene. I'm not here to pretend like 4 has this down pat. It doesn't. I love the addition of the grappling hook as much as the next guy, but the gameplay otherwise is practically a carbon copy of its predecessors, meaning Nate's hands aren't any less filthy despite him being this legendary hero. However, these punch-outs with Nadine are actually some of the few examples where the gameplay does complement the narrative circumstances. Prior to their first fight, there are very little to no interactive segments that actually give the player the impression that Nate is this old man. Given how consistent Uncharted gameplay is, for all I know, he's still in his 20s. Now, this really isn't a criticism at all, because, hot take, I don't think anyone wants to play a game with a back problem mechanic mechanic where Nate moves as slow as molasses. The devs had to find some other method to get that feeling across, and what better way than by having her midlife crisis having Joe getting absolutely thrashed by a trained military leader. And despite this far more dire matchup, the tone is kept light and humorous with Nate cracking his usual one-liners, except with their effect amplified thanks to his extreme contrast to Nadine's nature.
Okay, mango.
What are you on about?
Oh, it's my safe word.
Naughty Dog manages to maintain that fun feeling of Uncharted that us fans adore, while still accomplishing their essential mission of engaging the player in this different coming out of retirement vibe. Given that him being washed up is half the premise, it was crucial that they got this across in more than just cutscenes. In my opinion, they achieved that here. The devs instantly get you on board with Nate's novel struggle because he gets his cheeks clapped by Nadine. Naughty Dog gets you to feel that age and expect Drake to perform accordingly. But I guess 4 years later they just forgot how? Anyway, the point is, these fights are actually pretty dope, but maybe don't make an Uncharted spin-off fighting game if it's gonna play like this. Thanks.
If you guys enjoyed GPS, and you can find more of him in the link below. Regardless of the issues surrounding Nadine's power, few can deny that her and Rafe are predictably underdeveloped. There's a running theme throughout the game of inheritance. Rafe got money and the Drakes got nothing outside of the gene lottery, and Nadine got her father's militia that was failing. It's interesting to see that in order to pay off her company's debt and recoup their reputation, Nadine is working with Rafe, who wants to build a reputation of his own. The two have similar motivations for finding the treasure, with the key difference being greed, which leads one to their death and the other to something as close to riches as they can get. The dynamic between the two was alright, as it seems Nadine in almost a resentful motherly way keeps Rafe in check.
Exactly how you're going to be leaving in a goddamn
Rafe!
lot.
But there isn't much development from either of them. I know Nadine gets more screen time in Lost Legacy, which I will cover in a different video, but here she falls victim to the Uncharted villain role, meaning there's little for us to learn about her. Her and Rafe just needed more development and screen time. I wish I had more to say, but there isn't much to go on here. Fortunately, other side characters like Elena pick up the slack. The scenes with her were often to the detriment of Nate, as she stole the show in my eyes. In fact, one of her best scenes is in the game's opening hours when she plays a game with Nate. The two are just talking, and while it is mundane, it's written so well that I couldn't help but love it. Her more disappointed scenes carry an equivalent weight, and when she does find out about Nate's lie, you can see her trust in him shatter. And Elena playing with her ring is not due to any nervousness or anxiety. Hell, anyone capable of punching this guy in the face has no fear, but it's because their marriage is compromised. She twists the ring around because their marriage is faltering, and the best part of the argument is that she isn't mad that Nate went on an adventure, she's mad that he lied. While Nate and Elena share their journey on the island with some tension, adventuring together is also integral to rekindling their trust, and making it clear to them that searching for clues and treasure hunting is what they live for. Elena has constantly had to remind Nate that she enjoys the adventure too, but she has her shit together, which is the largest difference between them. They share their passions but complement each other so well. Nate brings the luck, and Elena brings the level-headed planning, but of course, Sully always has the wisecracks covered. Sully this time around, like most entries, isn't given much development, and that's okay. He served his role as mentor well in the first 3 entries, so I don't mind him taking a back seat, especially since he's charming as ever. The story this time around, while following the same archetype of previous entries, succeeds where others failed. Rather than presenting a web of plot threads all leading nowhere, it has just a few that are more developed and thought-provoking. More importantly, the development given has ditched the immaturity for a story that stays grounded to the end. While the previous entries did little to stay grounded, any semblance of realism was shot when the supernatural elements showed up. Surviving a plane or train crash is less fantastical when the bar is raised to an ancient race with teleporting abilities. A Thief's End stays grounded until the end. Not entirely realistic, but it never loses its plausibility. Nate isn't a superhuman, he is just really lucky. And Uncharted is at its best when answering one question: what would it look like if the luckiest man in the world was in the most extreme situations? It isn't realistic, but it's possible. And while many could argue that the teleporting demonic souls could also be real, it also isn't a stretch to say that it is highly unlikely. Not having anything to raise the bar of realism and recontextualize the whole playthrough at the end of the game does the plot favors in the pacing and consistency department. The lack of ghosts and ghoulies also prevents the plot from getting distracted, keeping the characters front and center. But like his previous entries, Uncharted 4 is a game that surpasses the sum of its parts. The addition of a rope swing takes the action to new heights, preventing the more grounded set pieces from feeling boring. The gunplay is the same as usual, though again, I suck at it, so don't confuse the footage on screen with poor controls. The voice acting is aided by the visuals, which often convey more than the dialogue does. When not looking at the faces, you'll be feasting your eyes on scenery, which never fails to amaze. Vistas are the prettiest we've seen, and there is never a lack of detail. Boss fights were not much better than previous entries, but were ultimately done the best here despite the bar being on the floor. Ultimately, what I love about A Thief's End is its singular phrasing. This is the end of Nate's story. but not the end of Uncharted. There are still stories to be told. Hell, just the adventures with Sam and Sully alone could fill out a trilogy. The ending leaves enough room for Cassie to be passed the torch, and even then, if we want to stay with Nate and Elena, there are sure to be adventures that can be explored there. An immediate issue is that their adventures after Uncharted 4 are seemingly legal and by the book, which don't offer room for shooting at pirates, but again, Cassie, Sam and Sully, or Nadine and Chloe can fill that void. The series chooses to have its swan song not only encompass the themes of the trilogy, but act as a recap along the way. The first game had themes of discovering the truth of your idols and greatness from small beginnings. The second game showed us that there is no honor among thieves and that Nate, in most cases, is just too nice to make it in this business. Uncharted 3 chose to delve into Nate's childhood and his obsession, or competitiveness, and A Thief's End, like any good conclusion, summarizes the focuses of the series, but adds even more information and polish to make crossing the finish line even sweeter. Its gameplay is the best in the series, presentation the same, music the same, and its story, while falling into its old habits at times, otherwise blows it out of the water. An exceptional game to end off an exceptional quadrilogy. One that is fueled by its main theme, passion. And I hope Naughty Dog has learned the lesson it preached, which was to not indulge in a passion to the point that it is your doom. This is why I am happy that as of writing, Uncharted 4 is the last we've seen of Nathan Drake. And while the passion of the Uncharted series may be over, the passion project that is Nathan Drake is finally complete. After months of rumors and leaks, it seems that discussions surrounding Uncharted's future are ramping up again. Uncharted 4 was, to mine and basically everyone else's understanding, the end of the Uncharted franchise. I mean, it was called The Thief's End, what else would you expect? Well, you wouldn't expect Naughty Dog to release a smaller title taking place directly after Uncharted 4 just a year later. And with the title of Lost Legacy. The title itself prompts many questions. Whose legacy are we talking about here? Why is it lost? Is it Nadine's legacy being the political discussion that ultimately eclipsed her role in Uncharted 4? Was it Chloe's absence in Uncharted 4? Is said Lost Legacy one that Naughty Dog intends to show us this time around, filling in the gaps left behind from Uncharted 4? Lost Legacy provides what every entry in the Uncharted franchise has to this point, much the same with minor improvements that often go a long way. But what Lost Legacy provides more than anything else is a glimpse into the future of the franchise, assuming that it isn't rebooted and remade 3 times in the next decade. But let's ignore the prospect of this entire storyline being rendered irrelevant and instead look at what we have right now. Lost Legacy is a spin-off of Uncharted 4, and one that comes at a reduced price, too. There was some controversy surrounding the price point, one that would be repeated with Miles Morales, and my opinion is that I like the idea. Having a smaller game at a cheaper price but keeping the AAA flair is something we don't see often, and I think a short and sweet experience is needed more and more when it seems every AAA title is an overambitious RPG. Most important in Lost Legacy's case is that while it is shorter than Uncharted 4, it does not feel like a spin-off. It offers very little in the way of an epilogue for Nate and friends, but most loose ends are tied up here, and avenues for future entries are paved. Lost Legacy in many ways is a direct response to the success and failures of Uncharted 4. Anything that was praised is doubled, and what was criticized is redeemed or cut out. While any proper sequel should strive to do this, Lost Legacy makes a point of not only changing what didn't work, but calling attention to it. Nadine was loved by many, but hated by many too, and her name carries baggage that almost certainly leads to discussion surrounded in heat from both sides. When Chloe explains during a drive that she chose to work with Nadine because of her reputation, I can't help but assume that this sentence carries a meaning beyond the fourth wall. Other aspects that some players had issues with in Uncharted 4, like the abundance of crate pushing, is near immediately shut down, with a straightforward line saying that we won't be doing that anymore. Personally, while I heavily enjoyed Uncharted 4, I found its color palette to be at times a bit too muddy, which feels like mere shades of brown when compared to the added vibrance presented here. Even the first glance we get showcases the back alleys through lamplights and neon that justify the new photo ops that appear throughout the game. These photos, which can be viewed through Chloe's phone, do feel as though the game is encouraging us to appreciate the beautiful environments, which takes away some of the wonder. A game doing something well is not as impressive in my eyes if it feels the game is always pointing it out, saying, "Hey, look here, isn't this cool?" I'm admittedly reading too far into this, and an argument can be made that said showboating is earned, because Lost Legacy is the best the series has looked. This isn't achieved by overhauling the technical side, at least I don't think. Chloe shares many animations with Nathan, and plenty things like movement and shooting are the same as Uncharted 4, but it's in the way those technical feats are presented. Wide open vistas are now just as common as the shallow lit caves. It's also shocking to me how good the water looks in this game. This is all being captured on the PS5 using the Legacy of Thieves collection, which I'd recommend you pick up if you can. Much like its older brother, the cutscenes here and specifically the facial expressions are immaculate and well shot. Subtle emotions are easily noticeable on characters' faces, and vocal performances are up to Naughty Dog's standards, which are at this point state of the art. New voices like Asav deliver in spades as his burly exterior is near perfectly subdued by a subtle and gentle delivery.
What a pleasant surprise.
If this is the future of Uncharted, gorgeous cutscenes, colorful palettes, and a AAA budget regardless of our cast, our future is already looking bright. But presentation has always been a strong suit for Uncharted, and its gameplay in fairness is still on the simple side. Innovation is slim, but as boring as it sounds to say, it still works. Set pieces are still as predictable as ever, and the gunplay is archaic as ever, but the additions to exploration and stealth brought with Uncharted 4 allow the gameplay to be more varied and fresh. Combat on the whole is the same, but there are a few more instances of hand-to-hand combat where countering is swapped out for dodging. I don't mind this change, but it means that in the middle of a tight rooftop brawl, you'll be diving across the floor into a roll. Otherwise, these things pick up right where they left off. But the greater density of turrets and silenced pistols round out the gameplay in a great way. I have always respected the way Uncharted approaches stealth. It was not until Uncharted 4 a means of thinning numbers to make the gunfights easier, never the intended solution to the problem. In Uncharted 4 and now Lost Legacy, a majority of the encounters can be finished in stealth and with forgiving detection speeds. Not only does this add more variety to the game, but considering how I've been marathoning the games lately, I can't help but appreciate a new way to take down patrols. The silenced pistol is scarce enough to make each shot worthy of consideration, but not so scarce as to never use them. Certain enemies can't be killed in one shot either, so you have to try and take down the armored foes by hand, and the weaker ones that might be farther away can eat a bullet. It adds more strategy to a still shallow system. Nadine will, like previous companions, point out obstacles or enemies, but will also take a few down with you. And it's still amazing that if their AI decides to wave at the enemy mid-stealth, you aren't caught because of it. The stealth here lacks the flair that comes from hiding bodies, luring enemies with rocks, and hiding spots outside of tall grass, but it was still fun for a majority of my playthrough. When you are going in loud, you'll experience the usual Uncharted set pieces that never fail to entertain. Being chased by an APC has more depth now as the rope swing is implemented and verticality plays a greater role. Climbing up the falling tower was one of my favorites, and the opening chase from the beginning of the game emphasizes a small quality of life change that goes a long way for realism: speed. In previous entries, Nate and friends would move through falling trains with the same speed they would carry through a morning jog, but in Lost Legacy, when things go south, Chloe and Nadine haul ass, which gives the action elevated adrenaline. The greatest expansion in Lost Legacy's gameplay is, well, expansion. This is a glimpse into the future of Uncharted's gameplay. One not with an open world, but a series of small sandboxes for you to roll around in. Naughty Dog dipped their toes into this idea in Uncharted 4, and its return in expansion bodes well for Lost Legacy. They even further your reasons for exploring. Treasures, a staple up to this point, have never been desirable, but their rewards are. This could be due to a lack of item descriptions as you just fiddle with models, but the reward was always the skins and the game effects that said treasures granted, which return in full force. My thoughts on these are unchanged, but I appreciate that Chloe, since her outfit doesn't change much, is given 2 more alternate outfits inspired by both pirates and westerns. I wish Uncharted 4 did this more, and again, they have shown that there is no shortage of ideas. Take a look at the multiplayer. To add on to this reward is a treasure radar. The ruby bracelet will glow and make a rather irritating sound when close to treasures. It's a simple change but goes a long way for encouraging exploration. I can't expect the player to peek around every corner to find goodies, but we can expect that of a player that knows something is nearby. I no longer have to fight the constant battle between, well, there might be something behind that bush, but the last 10 bushes have had nothing, and this is already such an open space, I don't want to waste my time. Now, I can know when I should be paying closer attention, and maybe this is just my own boredom and lack of curiosity manifesting, but this change is an appreciated one, and kept the pace up too. You find this item by collecting 11 tokens scattered across the Western Ghats. This is the first genuine side quest we've seen in Uncharted, and it is like playing a new game. You had markers on the map that highlighted tokens locked behind puzzles, combat, or simply traversal. Some of the puzzles presented in side caves were challenging and, like Uncharted 4, the best in the series. Gameplay itself is puzzle-like too, as you still need to find the correct way to approach even the simplest of tasks for often little reason. There are still some issues regarding the theme of Uncharted breaking when you don't do exactly what it wants. When descending a tower, I had assumed I could use my rope to rappel down and either swing to another rope or land on a platform well within my reach. The intended solution was to walk down a specified staircase, to then jump to the anchor point, which ended up being higher and farther away than where I was swinging from before. Moments of frustration like this are uncommon, but it flies in the face of what was otherwise Uncharted attempting to be more open-ended, a decision that breathes a new life into the series. The classic Uncharted formula is still here, and in fact, some highlights from previous games are directly expanded upon. Everyone loves the train sequence from Uncharted 2, and Lost Legacy decides to give it another try. I wish I could say it adds enough to the mix to make it better or worse, but it feels like a retread in memory. The incorporations of rope swinging and vehicles chasing the train to shoot you gives the sequence a greater scope, but it doesn't feel fresh, just different. I don't think this is indicative of Naughty Dog running out of ideas, rather they just felt like revisiting the moment the series is arguably known for. I had wished there was more combat on the train, especially ones where we have to traverse both the inside and outside to advance, but it was mostly shooting at enemies on bikes. It's during this segment that I remembered I need to tell you all that I, for some reason, can't get my baby hands to use the DualSense 5, and that the controls feel tight and accurate, but they won't fix my aim. Back to the train, I think it would have been interesting to have a minigun mounted on one of the cars, and we have to jump around or swing around the outside of the cart to then end the swing back inside behind the gunner. Moments like these are passed up for the equally visceral addition of jumping from the train to a car and back, which are still enjoyable to me. Lost Legacy's memorable moments come from what it does new. For example, near the end of the game, there is a boss fight against Orca who has piloted a helicopter. You begin the encounter by moving through the rubbled shacks and tall grass, but as you take down enough enemies, Orca's helicopter circles the area and must be taken down using explosives found in different chests. After you fire a rocket, you can go undercover and re-enter stealth, taking down reinforcements on your way to the next chest. It's in its final phase that you can use the rope to climb up to the helicopter and take it down, which was one of my favorite moments in the game. But when it comes to the new and memorable, Lost Legacy found its identity in the Western Ghats. Having an open area to explore and drive around in is a great idea and works surprisingly well for Uncharted. There are some things missing, like a sprint button, something that brought its contemporaries praise, but the companions reduce tedium. Nadine can help in combat and stealth and drive the car to you if you venture off on foot. If Uncharted's future was an open world game, I don't know for how long it could continue to grasp its linearity. The open area does not always feel open. Rather, it acts as a web with 15 different linear paths that all branch out from the large tower that oversees it. I don't think this idea is bad, and I think it's the best balance to strike between linear and non-linear, but the game feels like standard Uncharted up until Chapter 4, evolves into a grand open adventure, and then shrinks back down by Chapter 5. Perhaps a better balance would be to have a general hub with weapons and treasures like this area is, and then each chapter could be a path that branches off. But importantly, by the end of the chapter, you could return back to the hub. In its current state, it's a hub you pass through, though don't let these thoughts convince you that it's bad. The final boss fight against the Sav shows that Uncharted has learned that its boss fights work better when cinematics are prioritized over mechanics. If you disagree, look no further than Lazarevich and Navarro. A mechanically deep fight and a final test of skill can work, as is the case with Orca's helicopter, but if Naughty Dog can't come up with a good idea for a final boss, executing it in a glorified QuickTime event works well. So long as a penultimate fight is a true challenge and renders the following fight a victory lap, it can continue into Uncharted's future. Another change that Lost Legacy makes is that, on top of ditching the supernatural elements of the first 3 games, does not focus on the journey of a prior explorer, and instead explores the mythology of the region. Instead of following the footsteps of an ancient adventurer, we are discovering the history of the location and the stories associated with them. It still feels like Uncharted, and its result isn't anything too different from past games, but if expanded upon more, it could yield better stories. Regardless, the story here feels similar to Uncharted 4, all the way down to having a 2-on-1 fight that you lose in the beginning but win by the end. I think Asav is a much better villain than Nadine and Wraith. In both cases, the villains were underdeveloped, and especially in Nadine's case, she lacked a ton of threat because of her compass. She was always, up until the end, under the command of Wraith's wealth. In many scenes, she comes across like an annoyed parent whose child won't stop throwing tantrums. The other issue is that Nadine and Wraith pose physical threats, but to no one other than Drake. If Drake wanted to, he could just let them get the treasure. Asav, on the other hand, is a hunk who poses a severe physical threat and an ideological threat. If he gets the tusk, it's not like he's going to simply add it to his collection, or sell it and live it up big in Dubai. He's going to start a civil war. It further helps that his gentle, unassuming exterior is contrasted by his actions that see him immediately going for the kill to anyone who opposes him, and his radical means of reforming. He is ultimately just another Uncharted villain, but for a smaller story like this, and one that is clearly focused more on its protagonists, I can appreciate that. Said protagonists are treated well and are done better than their previous installments. Chloe didn't have much to add other than intoxicating charisma in her appearances, and Nadine was at best another lame villain and at worst detestable. Lost Legacy, when examining these characters, feels like an addendum to Uncharted 4, where they rework and redeem previous characters. Chloe is given a proper backstory and her moral compass is defined. She's a thief and a liar, yes, but she's not evil. She reflects the player in that while we enjoy mowing down the goons in front of us and destroying hundreds of acres of preserved land in the process, when it's revealed that a bomb is going to go off in the city we started the game at, Chloe and the player think of the same thing. The charming little girl from the intro, just trying to get by. She, much like any morally questionable hero, has a soft spot for the little guy. Nadine, on the other hand, begins the game with the same attitude that she held in Uncharted 4. The straight-laced demeanor and permanent scowl slowly crumbles away as she and Chloe bond. They begin cracking jokes with one another, gossiping about the Drake brothers, and it's good to see this other side of Nadine. I think the reason Nadine doesn't fully redeem herself here is because she is the side character, and her personality is always overpowered by Chloe, whose screen presence is as strong as ever. As the plot goes on, it's revealed that Asav's expert that Chloe knows about is Samuel Drake, which angers Nadine because she never told her. In the moment where the two are split up again, we get whiplash from being brought from the height of their friendship and chemistry to where the game started, square one. Even if this game has flaws, the fact it made me miss a character I initially didn't enjoy is worthy of praise. Once Sam is properly reintroduced, it highlights a strength about not just Lost Legacy, but the Uncharted series as a whole, which is that its identity is not directly tied to Nathan Drake. Nadine and Chloe still carry the Uncharted identity, especially in the way Chloe cracks jokes in the face of certain death, but the exploration, banter, and combat are all so Uncharted that I can't help but feel that if Nathan Drake were to stay retired, it would almost be for the best. And this game is proof of that. I theorized in my Uncharted 4 video that if Naughty Dog wanted to continue the series, they could do so with Sam and Sully on an adventure, but now I believe this could expand even further. Now I think we could easily have a game with Sam and Chloe, perhaps even a new character that Sam meets. If we want to stay in the family, we can have Nate's daughter Cassie begin her own adventures as an adult, initially hiding it from her parents. Potentially halfway through the game, a now older Drake can show concern and disappointment that his lust for adventure is threatening to take his daughter's life, like the many times it almost took his. This could lead Nate to questioning why he was comfortable doing it himself, but not with others. Maybe it's because he's not confident that his ungodly luck was passed on to Cassie, but it could resolve with Nate offering help. He's of course too old for this, so maybe he becomes the new Sully, the wisecracking veteran that drives the boats and flies the planes. Elena might be harder to convince, but if anyone is capable of being caught in the same competitive snare of beating someone else to a treasure, it's Nate. I may be straying too far from the point, which is that the Uncharted series does not need a reboot to continue, nor does it even need Nathan. Uncharted has a wide cast of intriguing characters, all capable of carrying their own products. It's clear that as far as gameplay goes, there's more that can be innovated upon, and further expansion can occur. A new game could present an even larger world, one that still carries secret caves and high-octane set pieces, similar to what Rise of the Tomb Raider achieved. There are a near infinite amount of myths to explore, locales to visit, and stories to tell, and Uncharted's future is bright, so long as it lets Nathan Drake rest. I can understand wanting another Uncharted game, or wanting a new adventure, or wanting to see more of your favorite character, but it should be remembered that with each new entry, there is a risk of failure, and creating a permanent scratch on the polished reputation of these games. I know Naughty Dog has a solid track record, but even look at games like The Last of Us Part 2. Some hate that game so much that they believe it ruins the legacy of the first. Better yet, think about Assassin's Creed. As the games have evolved, they've sacrificed an identity, a loyal fan base, and unique mechanics in pursuit of a broader appeal. The Uncharted legacy can't change if it's left finished, and the older games, specifically the Nathan Drake games, are not going away. If Uncharted wants to move in a new direction, it should do so with a new character that signifies said shift. Rebooting the series just feels unnecessary, and honestly, the fact it's rumored to be developed by a different studio just feels like Sony cashing in on the brand name. If these rumors are true, I'm not hopeful for the future of the franchise. I'll be viewing any new release as a studio taking a polished relic in Naughty Dog and Sony's history and stealing it for monetary exploitation. But you know what they say, no honor among thieves. The Uncharted series for a time was the face of the PlayStation. One could argue that Nathan Drake has been since dethroned by the likes of Kratos, Spider-Man, Ellie, or Aloy, but few can deny the unprecedented success of the Uncharted franchise. Over the last year and a bit, I have been revisiting these games, and now that I've talked about all of them, including Golden Abyss, I'm going to try and answer the question, what is the best Uncharted game? I'll be ranking them from worst to best considering the gameplay, story, presentation, puzzles, and I'll not be factoring in multiplayer as the remastered versions of the Nathan Drake games do not include them, and I imagine that will be the version those who have not experienced the games will start with. I'll be ranking all the games, and then after I'll rank some more minor things. With that said, let's not delay and begin the list. And feel free to tell me your list below. A list like this is entirely my opinion, and I'd love to know the reasons that you might agree or disagree. So without further ado, number 6, Uncharted Golden Abyss. I almost feel bad for calling this the worst Uncharted game. In a vacuum, it does many things right. The gameplay is relatively tight, and its set pieces, while held back due to its handheld state, are still impressive and fun. Actually, the fact we have a competent Uncharted game on a handheld is where a lot of the strengths lie. This is one of the better games for the Vita in my opinion, but it suffered like many first-party titles in that a handful of gimmicks were stuffed into this game, making the gameplay consistently tedious. You'll do everything through the swipe of a screen, combat, quick time events, boss fights, and it is never as fun as the game seems to think it is. The gunplay here is hindered by the system as its thumbsticks are terribly small, leading to plenty of inaccuracy, but the game never got too difficult to handle. The aforementioned final boss is probably one of the worst in the series, as it is a series of screen swipes, which even if done perfectly will take literal minutes to complete, and the entire chapter dedicated to swiping as a means of rowing a boat was simply boring, which is something Uncharted games do not achieve very often. The puzzles here were pretty good, better than Uncharted 1 for sure, but the reward for finding puzzles were, rather than fun skins or cheats, were cards for a mobile spin-off game, which made finding treasures pretty pointless. The story for this game took place before Drake's Fortune, which allowed it to go balls to the wall without impacting the lore too much. However, it feels even more disconnected as certain characters like Chase are forgotten about right after the credits roll. Perhaps this too is due to the lower budget, but I appreciated the more grounded story. It still had its fantastical elements, but no demons or ancient civilizations to speak of, which was refreshing. It helped keep the story as realistic as possible, or at least realistic by Uncharted standards. I'd say if you have a Vita, it's worth giving a try, but don't go buying a Vita just for this. Ultimately, this game is just fine. It has some upsides, some downsides, but they all come together to form a mediocre game. It's also tough to say if it's mediocre because of its individual facets, or because it stands next to the mainline big budget entries. But I think few could argue that it comes close to any of the other entries, that is, barring our number 5 spot. Number 5, Uncharted Drake's Fortune. If I was ranking these games based on impact or importance, this would be much higher. But on its own, Drake's Fortune has aged horribly. Look, I know that times were different and I respect that, but compared to everything else in the series, time has been less than kind to this game. Its graphics are still good, but it lacks a memorable art direction, especially given that its goal at the time was presenting state-of-the-art graphics. Animations were motion captured, which is great, but some animations still feel a bit cartoonish. The gameplay here is as familiar as ever. You move from light platforming to basic cover shooting with a few set pieces in between. It's a loop that lacks a ton of variety, but entertains for the runtime. Perhaps variety isn't worth it, since when they do branch out, we get the infamous not one, but 2 jet ski segments that are the leading cause of male baldness. The shooting feels fine and the glitches are admittedly slim, and the game is still fun to revisit just to see where everything started. The set pieces here are basic in comparison to even the next game, and plenty of series trends were started here. Poor boss fights, the entire structure of the story, the treasures, the bonuses, and the guns all return down the line. What is here is a bit more small scale, especially when we look at the environments. Rarely do locales differ from forests and caves, and when they do in the case of the World War II bunkers, it is still moving through relatively bare color palettes. The supernatural enemies that accompany this new setting is a fun mix-up to the combat that requires you to, instead of shooting from behind cover, run and gun. The puzzles here are barely worthy of that title, as I often see you looking at your journal for the direct answer, removing any brain work. The largest problem with the first Uncharted, aside from its comparison to the other games, is that while the rest of the series had low points, this game had downright annoying parts. Moments I dreaded returning to, and they arrived at such a consistent pace I found myself on a roller coaster of emotions. Said emotions being anger, followed by decompression and eventual irritation again. What doesn't help is the final boss. The very last moment of the game is a letdown. Many of these things were improved in this game's sequel, and even more so in Uncharted 3. I think my hottest take regarding this series is that Uncharted 2 and 3 sit very close together on this list, and while it was difficult to decide, I think you'll understand my decision. Number 4, Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception. Comparisons have been made between Uncharted and the standard cinematic blockbuster, and I believe these comparisons are just, and there is no greater game that represents the idea of turning your brain off and consuming big explosions and dumb action than Uncharted 3. The action here is non-stop, and neither player nor Nate has more than a few seconds to breathe between set pieces, and I'd even argue that so much of the game is high octane that it all blends together. No greater proof of this is seen than in my review of the game. I was talking about the set pieces, and many noted that I did not bring up the scene where you traverse a cruise ship and escape from it as it comes crashing down. This was not because it wasn't special, but because there is so much going on and the game is sensory overload for so much of its runtime that I genuinely forgot about it. It got lost in the gray. It doesn't stop the set pieces from being fun, and something that elevates these moments is the gameplay, which is as tight and fun as ever. Aiming offers and rewards more precision. Combat has overhauls to make it more viable and mechanically deep, and the additions to the stealth give the gameplay some severely needed variety. The only real weak point of Drake's Deception is the story, which is by far one of the most forgettable in the series despite being the most ambitious. It tries to tell the origin story of Drake, and while the change up in characters, scenery, and time is nice, the story feels meandering for most of it, and this isn't even looking into the many plot holes and loose ends that went untied. I had also stated in my Uncharted 3 review that the gameplay is better than Uncharted 2, which I stand by. Enemy variety is better, and the contexts in which you shoot are more varied, but the reason Drake's Deception is still below falls down to the many points in which aspects of the game bring down the entire package. Uncharted 2, for comparison's sake, has a story that is fine. It's nothing special, but most of it works. Uncharted 3 has a story so lackluster that it ends up bringing down the entire product. The final levels when entering the fantastical Atlantis of the Sands are hampered by the enemies that have unreasonable health and the ability to teleport, making the tail end of the game dreadful. Puzzles, much like 2, were not anything special, but are a significant step up from Drake's Fortune. misfortune. The revamped hand-to-hand combat is appreciated, and the actual silenced pistol offers replayability, but ultimately Uncharted 3 does not hold up as well in memory as the number 3 spot. I should also mention that with all of these games, I don't think any of them are bad. In fact, everything from this point would be considered great, but it doesn't stop some from being better than others. Speaking of which, number 3, Uncharted 2, Among Thieves. Now, I know this is a bit of a hot take, but let's be real, this game has the slightest gallon of rose tint spilled over it, and this list would be boring as hell if Uncharted 2 was the best. That's not to say I'll change my opinion for the sake of being different or interesting. The first 3 spots thus far disprove that, as those takes are fucking lukewarm, but rather, let me cook. Uncharted 2 is a game that, like Uncharted 3, has aged surprisingly well. Shooting feels decent, the story isn't the best, but has countless memorable moments and set pieces, and the variety in gameplay is enough to make any consecutive playthrough still enjoyable. I also hold this game in high regard because it was one of the first games I played that felt next-gen to me. This game blew my socks off when I first played it, and the very first thing I did once I finished it was start another playthrough. In recent years, when attempting to set my biases aside, I found that Uncharted 2 does not hold up as well as I once thought. The game is still exceptional and has aged very well, but when those rose-tinted goggles come off, cracks begin to form, never progressing to fractures though. The gunplay feels better than Uncharted 1, but still feels lacking in the accuracy department. Aiming feels more responsive, sure, but every gun has such a wide bullet spread that precision isn't rewarded. You can aim perfectly at the head, and bullets will practically bend around the enemy, making harder difficulties more luck-based than it needed to be. Boss fights were also relatively boring, and in some cases brutally difficult, but it was at least better than previous attempts. In fact, that's where a lot of Uncharted 2's strengths lie. As a sequel, Uncharted 2 is among the best. The shooting feels better, combat is better, set pieces are crazier and more memorable, the pacing is more consistent, the dialogue is funnier, the secrets are more enticing, the environments are more diverse and detailed. Everything here is a step above its predecessor. Even as I write this, there are few moments in Uncharted 2 that I didn't enjoy, and the only downsides this game has are in respect to their sequels. Uncharted 2 has little focus on stealth, something later games would remedy, so coming back feels a bit restrictive, especially when the only silent weapon has a considerably short range and clip size. I believe that the next 2 entries are better, as their improvements to choice within gameplay make them far kinder to retrospective playthroughs. The soundtrack seemed to have been amped up with everything else, and the presentation comes together to make the game feel like the big budget blockbuster it is attempting to imitate. The story this time around was more fun, and the opening on the train solidifies intrigue from the moment you boot the game. Characters like Chloe and Elena bounce dialogue off each other almost as well as they bounce insults off of Drake, and your companions in gameplay never let a dull moment go by. Uncharted 2 is a classic, no matter which way you slice it, but I just so happen to enjoy the newer games more. It's funny, Uncharted 2 is such a difficult game to talk about in depth because the game is just good. Everything that matters is done with competence and grace, and the only criticisms I have towards the game, outside of the bullet spread criticism, is relatively meaningless. Among Thieves is truly a game more efficiently evaluated by stating what few things are wrong rather than spending an eternity talking about what it does right. If the Uncharted series ended at 3, then 2 would still be the absolute best in the series, but fortunately, that was not the case. Number 2, Uncharted Lost Legacy. Deciding between this game and Uncharted 4 was genuinely a challenge, because while Uncharted 4 had a great story and felt like it was a beautiful send-off for Nathan Drake, the gameplay was better in Lost Legacy. If Lost Legacy was longer and had more room to develop its characters and properly wrap up the loose ends left by Nathan, then it would easily be the best, but I think Uncharted 4 is a better overall product. Regardless, Uncharted 4 and Lost Legacy are leagues above the trilogy gameplay-wise. Climbing is more realistic, combat is just as good, gunplay is as tight as ever, and in Lost Legacy's case, the stealth is as fun as it gets. While previous Uncharted games let you merely thin the numbers in stealth, Uncharted 4 let you complete entire encounters in stealth. But there was a problem. Silenced weapons were extremely rare. Lost Legacy remedied this in an interesting way. Not by simply putting a silenced weapon in, but adding just a pistol, and with a limited number of bullets. This means you have only a few enemies that can be taken out silently at a medium range, but most enemies will still need to be taken out by hand. This makes stealth far more engaging and adds replay value. Once in combat, things are the same as Uncharted 4, but that's no insult, as A Thief's End presents the most dynamic and vertical combat, all thanks to the rope swing introduced in A Thief's End. Something else teased in 4 was the open-ended areas. This was expanded upon further to where up to a third of the game takes place in the relatively open Western Ghats. Yes, it is still rather linear in that the space acts as a central hub with multiple branching paths, but compared to the strict near shooting gallery linearity of previous entries, this feels like a glimpse at an open world Uncharted, and one that works surprisingly well. I mentioned this in my video on the game, but Lost Legacy offers a glimpse into the future of Uncharted, and what the series could look like moving forward. When it comes to the gameplay, I think Lost Legacy should be the blueprint. Even the boss fights, while not being anything to write home about, were more enjoyable than the first 3 attempts, and were on the same level as the Wraith fight, opting for cinematic quality over mechanics. The story is, like basically every Uncharted game, lacking. But this game made an effort to respond to the criticisms of Uncharted 4, specifically with Nadine. She wasn't received very well in Uncharted 4, and this is no surprise as she was the villain, and Uncharted villains being one note is par for the course, but Nadine struck a nerve with quite a few people. Lost Legacy made a direct effort to develop Nadine more, and the same was done with Chloe, though she didn't really need any reworking. I think this turned out well, and seeing the two bond over the course of the game was rather touching. Their petty gossip over each other's past highlights one of Uncharted's strengths, which is its moment-to-moment dialogue. This has always benefited the stories, as while on the whole the plots are lackluster, their individual moments are enjoyable enough to entertain in motion. The story here follows a similar structure, though I think I'm in the minority for enjoying a SOV. Overall, Lost Legacy is a solid footnote or addendum to Uncharted 4. It addresses many criticisms of both the story and gameplay of Uncharted 4, and while it isn't long, I'd prefer a shorter experience over a drawn-out one. The puzzles here were also the best in the series hands down, but ultimately, it falls below the #1 spot because it is disconnected from the rest of the series, and works as an epilogue. Whereas A Thief's End wrapped up the themes and ideas of 3 different games, while also overhauling everything from the presentation to the story and the gameplay. Number 1, Uncharted 4, A Thief's End. I'm sure many of you saw this coming. My video on Uncharted 4 was a glowing one, and rightfully so. Uncharted 4, especially off the back of the Nathan Drake trilogy, is a colossal improvement in every area. The rope swing is a simple, albeit predictable addition, as every game from 2014 to 2016 had a grappling hook or rope swing of some sort, but it makes the combat so much better. Nothing will ever be as satisfying as swinging from the top of the map onto some unsuspecting guard below. And when in those fights, Uncharted 4 had AI that, while not groundbreaking, kept things interesting, and your partners aided you more than in previous entries. In Stealth, they began pointing out where enemies are, and they can actually kill some of them in combat. The shooting was tighter, movement more accurate, and the Stealth is where we saw the largest leap in quality. The Stealth here features proper takedowns from cover, bushes, and the air, and in many cases it felt better to take the quieter route, and some scenarios could be skipped entirely. It made sense for someone like Nathan to begin playing a bit smarter given that he isn't getting any younger, and now that he has something to lose, being Elena. All of this is presented on a crisp, next-gen backdrop that to this day looks good. The Uncharted games have never struggled with graphics or realism, at least fidelity-wise, but A Thief's End feels like a true step up in that you can see characters' pores on their faces, and some scenes and ideas are entirely communicated through facial expressions. Few games can use a character's subtle facial movements to communicate full sentences, and it elevates the cutscenes in this game to new heights. But Uncharted 4's biggest strength, and at times biggest weakness, is its story, which had the highest ambitions of the series. Why is this? Because there's an actual story here. While the first 3 Uncharted games had enjoyable characters and moments, the overall story was relatively simple. This worked for those wanting a cheesy action flick in video game form, but time after time there were those asking for more. Uncharted 4 delivered that, and that is why it is so beloved, because there's so much to love. But there's also more to dislike. Look no further than Nadine, who was the center of many discussions, and her rather polarizing reception is still something that puzzles me, but it also illustrates something interesting about A Thief's End. In my research, I found that many loved Uncharted 4, but there was an undismissible group of those that didn't like it, which was larger than previous entries. As I'm sure you can assume, I'm part of the group that loved it, but that doesn't mean this game didn't have some problems, and unfortunately these problems are ones we have seen from the first entry. Since we've already brought up Nadine, we can also look at Wraith, who like every Uncharted villain up to this point was poorly developed and lacked a proper threat. Fortunately, other characters like Drake and Elena are given more depth than ever before, and the game explores their obsession with treasure hunting and adventure far more than Uncharted 3 even attempted to. The story is portrayed in gameplay, and themes like Nathan trying to live a normal life while fantasizing of a life of adventure is reflected in the player because much of the opening is rather mundane and sees Nathan out of the action. The puzzles were, well, puzzles this time around, asking the player to consistently use their brain. While none were puzzles I'd be stuck on, they induced a few head scratches that were leagues above the puzzles in previous games, which were often not worthy of being called such. Uncharted 4 is Naughty Dog and Nathan Drake at their best. It's a game that thrives in the legacy of Nathan Drake, and wraps up his story perfectly, while also leaving enough loose ends for future games to tie up. I mentioned this in my Lost Legacy video a lot, but I really don't like the idea of getting a new Uncharted, be that a reboot or a sequel involving Drake. Lost Legacy is an exception because it explains what most of the characters are getting up to without Drake, which is to no one's surprise, the same old shenanigans. But as is the sentiment with these ranking videos, I hope this is the last we see of Nathan Drake. The rumors surrounding Uncharted's reboot are troubling, because it's so easy to see a heartless reboot that might be good, but feel uncanny compared to the originals. The 6 Uncharted games we have are all well made, not without flaws, but widely loved. So why do we need to continue to milk it? Well, I know the answer, you know the answer. Money. But I'm still holding out hope that the most we get are the first 3 Uncharted games on PC, and then Nathan Drake can be given some proper time out of the spotlight, only to be inevitably picked up later by developers that are in it for the passion. In fact, Nathan Drake could easily be replaced. When Tomb Raider was out of the spotlight, Uncharted scratched that itch, and now that both Uncharted and Tomb Raider haven't seen a release in years, I would love to see a new IP that carries the spirit of these games with them. But no matter the reboot or replacement, nothing will change how special the Uncharted games are to me. It was the first series of games games that changed my views on what a game could be. Growing up, the games I played were mostly fantasy games or ones with turn-based combat, and there's nothing wrong with that. But Uncharted was the first game I played to present a high-budget action that, at least for the time, looked as close to real life as I could see. From Project Big to A Thief's End, Uncharted was oozing with greatness, even in its small beginnings. And while corporate greed might take away the nice bow placed at the end of Nathan's story, they can't take away what the first 6 games achieved. So now that we've discussed where I rank the games, I will also do my best to rank some other aspects of the series, but I won't be going into any depth. Top 5 characters. Number 5, Sam. Number 4, Chloe. Number 3, Elena. Number 2, Sully. And number 1, Nathan. Top 5 boss fights. Number 5, Navarro. Number 4, Lazarevich. Number 3, Talbot. Number 2, Asav. Number 1, Wraith. Top 5 chapters. Number 5, Uncharted 2, Chapter 6. Number 4, Uncharted 3, Chapter 2. Number 3, Uncharted 4, Chapter 11. Number 2, Uncharted 2, Chapter 13. And number 1, Uncharted Lost Legacy, Chapter 4. Top 5 villains in no particular order because they all kind of suck. Nadine, Rafe, Lazarevich, Asav, Flynn, but fuck you guys, honestly. And that is about everything I have to say about the Uncharted series. My full thoughts are out there, and if you've watched all of this, then thank you for your support. The Uncharted games are so special to me, and it's been a joy to revisit these games and ultimately come to the conclusion that many of them have aged rather well. If there are any new Uncharted games, I'll be sure to cover them, even if I hope it doesn't happen. But in the meantime, thank you for joining me on this retrospective look at the series. If you have any further questions for me, then leave it below, and I'll try to get back to as many as I can. Stay safe, and take care.